Throughout the 1920s, China was divided between warlords, until in 1929, Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT had united most of the country. He did this with the aid of allied warlords like Li Zhongren and the new Guangxi clique in the south, Yan Zishan of Shaanxi in the north, and Feng Yuxiang and his Guominjun in the west. Plus, the Japanese assassinated their puppet ruler of Manchuria, Zhang Zhuolin, believing his son would make a better ruler. But his son Zhang Zuilin decided to break with Japan and align with the government in Nanjing. However, there were still a number of warlords and regions that were still largely free from Chiang's control, and those that were loyal to him presented a problem. Chiang Kai-shek hoped to unite the country into a centralized government, largely into a one-party state as well. This would mean breaking up the power that his allies had held for years, and of course this proved incredibly unpopular. So tensions were high and a civil war began almost immediately, thanks to a crisis in Hunan. This territory was under the control of Li Zhongren and the new Guangxi clique, but also within their territory was the remnant of the Wuhan government. This had been established by Wang Jingwei, but had essentially lost all of their power. Nevertheless, the Wuhan Sub-Council were angry with the governor of Hunan, Liu Diping. This was because he was paying taxes directly to Chiang Kai-shek in Nanjing and not via them. So they dismissed Liu, knowing that this was a clear move against Chiang. So both sides mobilized for war, and even though he didn't authorize the move, Li Zhongren fled to Nanking. So the Chiang-Gui War began. Li initially had the support of Bai Chongxi and Tang Shengxi, but soon Bai would surrender. Then Feng and Yang up in the north did denounce Chiang Kai-shek, but their generals didn't support intervening. So within 3 months, Li was defeated. He fled to Hong Kong and new commanders were sent to rule over the south. But they were unable to stop the rise of communist guerrilla forces under the control of Deng Xiaoping. So they too were removed from power, and one of these deposed governors was Li Mingroi, who actually defected to the communists. So the region fell into chaos. This allowed Li Zhongren to return to the region 6 months later, and by now the other leaders were wary of Chiang Kai-shek. After all, he had just tried to crush a former ally. So Li Zhongren, Bai Chongxi, Feng Yuxiang, Tang Shengxi, Yan Zishan, and others united to form into an anti-Chiang alliance. And they planned on making Yan president, while Wang Jingwei, Chiang's old rival, returned and he would be the new prime minister. Together they all began to march on Nanjing in May 1930, starting the Central Plains War. Initially, Feng's northeast army won an early victory and attacked Suzhou, but in this assault on the city, tens of thousands, if not up to 200,000 men died, and it also ended in favour of Chiang due to the lack of coordination between the various warlords. So with the north safe, in June, Chiang moved south and encircled the armies of Li Zhongren and Bai Chongxi. Then, quickly moving once again, he marched north, successfully delaying his demise until that September he was provided a couple lifelines. First in Gansu, where the Muslims were already rebelling against Feng, the Christian warlord. Well, there, members of the Ma clique, like Ma Bufang and Ma Fuxian, pledged their allegiance to Chiang and, with KMT support, increased their attacks on the Guominjun, until finally they reclaimed a lot of their land. Then Zhang Zuilin finally declared support for Chiang as well, and his Manchurian forces marched south and captured Beijing. With this, Yang and Feng resigned, and the Central Plains War came to an end late in the year. Nearly 1 million people took part in this conflict, and hundreds of thousands died, ultimately weakening China once again. The first country to take advantage of this, though, was not Japan, it was Tibet. Many ethnic Tibetans actually lived under Chinese control, so they still held claims to those lands. But also, the Dalai Lama had fallen out with the Panchen Lama, who sought refuge in China. Tensions were therefore high, but the actual conflict erupted when the chieftain of Beri in Sichuan seized properties belonging to the Dalai Lama. He was probably under the command of the Panchen Lama, but this prompted a local dispute, and both the Tibetan government and a warlord in Sichuan named Liu Wenhui were called to help the respective sides. Tibet attacked Sichuan numerous times, but were constantly defeated. Nevertheless, in 1932, they also decided to attack Ma Bufang and his Ma clique. But why they did this is open for debate. The Tibetans, with their faulty weapons and poorly trained army, lost many battles, many of which involved swords and hand-to-hand combat. Plus, as this war was between Muslims and Buddhists, many religious buildings and texts were burnt, along with a whole host of other war crimes. In the end, the British pressured the Chinese to make peace after they began advancing further into Tibet. So the Ma clique won, and Ma Bufang was able to capture counties in Xikang province, which the Tibetans had actually seized way back in 1919. Otherwise, within China, even though Chiang was temporarily able to get rid of his enemy warlords, the past wars had allowed the communists to set up Soviets across the country. Mao had previously set up a base in the mountains of Jinganshan, but the KMT forced them to flee to Ruijin, where they established the Jiangxi Soviet. But this again was just one of many at that time. Plus, Mao was generally seen as an outsider in the larger Communist Party, as he disagreed with the focus on workers and preferred to mobilize the peasants. So he began to distrust many in his ranks and began to purge them, believing they were working for the KMT's anti-Bolshevik League. In response, some soldiers mutinied, but the Futian incident of December 1930 failed, and Mao just reinforced his own position. In total, maybe 100,000 people died in these early purges and repression of locals. Meanwhile, Deng Xiaoping, who had already been defeated in the south, moved to Shanghai. There he met Zhou Enlai, and soon they would both arrive in the Jiangxi Soviet. But so too would the Central Committee, as they saw Jiangxi had become the major stronghold for communism. This Central Committee was led by Li Leshan, but he had launched many failed campaigns and fell out with other members. So the Soviet Union sealed his fate and sent 28 Bolsheviks to China to increase their own influence. These were communists who had been trained up in Moscow, like Bo Gu and Wang Ming. These reduced Mao's influence once again. Plus, Chiang Kai-shek tried to crush these Soviets through a series of encirclement campaigns. But these campaigns ended in failure due to, once again, poor coordination. In fact, the KMT troops actually shelled themselves, and by early 1931, thousands of KMT soldiers had either been killed or captured. Then, by 1931, Chiang's attention was focused elsewhere, so the communists were left alone for a while. For starters, the Xinjiang Wars erupted in the far west. This region had been ruled over by Yang Zhengqing until 1928, when he was assassinated. A Han man named Jin Shu-ren took over as governor, and he began to confiscate the local Uyghur land. He then turned to invade the Kumul Khanate in the northeast. This was a semi-autonomous region, which was a remnant of the old Chagatai Khaganate. They had largely been left in peace for centuries, so long as they sent tribute to the capital of Urumqi. But in 1930, the leader of the Khanate died, and Jin Shu-ren used this as an opportunity to invade. The former ruler's advisor, Yulbaz Khan, appealed for help from Ma Zhongying and his Ma clique, who invaded from the east. But Jin enlisted the support of both exiled White Russians and even troops from the Soviet Union, who were looking to expand their influence. In response to Jin's Soviet alliance, Chiang Kai-shek decided to support Ma. So for now, this part of the Xinjiang Wars, the Kumul Rebellion, saw the KMT and Ma clique fighting against Jin and his white and red Russian soldiers. But it will get a lot more complicated later on. In fact, it got even more complicated for Chiang as well, as over in Manchuria, the Japanese began to make moves. I should say that it wasn't the central government who planned this, as Prime Minister Rajiro actually tried to disarm the ultra-nationalist Cherry Blossom Society after their failed coup in March 1931. Yet the Japanese army could and did act independently of their government, and the nationalists saw Manchuria as key to Japanese ambitions. They already had railway lines there, and its raw materials could help Japan during the Depression. Plus, the army developed the concept of Hokushin-ron, or a northern expansion route, invading through Manchuria and then launching a preemptive war against their chief rival, the Soviet Union. One of the chief proponents of this plan was the authoritarian Sado Araki, and his followers made plans to blow up a section of their own railway line in Manchuria and blame it on the Chinese. This, the Mukden incident, was carried out in September 1931. This gave the Japanese a cause for war, and it was followed by a full invasion. Chiang's Northeast Army had been called south during the Central Plains War and had suffered heavily. Plus, Chiang Kai-shek was unready for total war, so he ordered Chiang not to confront the Japanese and withdraw. He firmly believed that the League of Nations would settle the issue, and the Lytton Commission did denounce Japan as the aggressor. But Japan just pulled out of the League of Nations, so they were free to occupy most of Manchuria within just a couple months. Yet now they needed a leader for this new puppet state, and they turned to the deposed emperor Puyi, who was living in Japanese Tianjin. The Japanese spy master Kenji Doihara met with him, and through one of his agents, persuaded him to accept the throne in Manchukuo, their new puppet state. This agent, by the way, was Yoshiko Kawashima, an openly bisexual former Qing princess who often dressed as a man. So Puyi travelled to Manchuria, but he was informed that he would be ruling over a republic, and he could not use terms like the Mandate of Heaven or even be called Your Imperial Majesty. But he was in no position to really argue these terms, so he accepted, and the first Japanese puppet was created in China. Straight away though, the Japanese had to deal with banditry across the region, and thousands of troops were sent in to quell them. Yet Manchuria remained one of the most prosperous regions in China, thanks to their previous investments, and resources like iron and soybeans were seen as lifelines to Japan in the Great Depression. Plus, further money would be made from the opium trade, which the Mitsui Company had a monopoly over. However, besides the obvious repression, Japanese rule in Manchuria also saw horrific crimes committed in the name of medical research. This began in 1932 when Shiro Ishii, the Surgeon General, was put in command of the Army Epidemic Prevention Lab. Here they would torch people alive with flamethrowers to test out new weapons, expose them to extreme cold to test frostbite, forced pregnancies and fetal experiments. In all, just imagine the worst forms of experiments you can, and this is how maybe around 300,000 people lost their lives. Plus, the Japanese army even tried to start a full-scale invasion of the rest of China by sending Buddhist monks to Shanghai. There they began to shout anti-Chinese slogans, which prompted them to be attacked, and thus the Japanese army responded. But the League of Nations actually stepped in and organised a ceasefire in March, which demilitarised the city. Fortunately for China, there was also upheaval in Japan, as ultranationalists had tried to launch another coup in October 1932. Then a group called the League of Blood assassinated the new prime minister after he refused to recognise Manchukuo as a state. So China had avoided a full-scale war for now. Back in China though, the fall of Manchuria allowed the former warlords to slip back into power. Yan Xishan arrived back in Shanxi, where students and nationalists protested against the Nanjing's government inaction. So, using the chaos, Yan gathered together his supporters and seized power in Taiyuan, removing the KMT again from the area, while Chiang could do very little about it. Li Zhongreng, on the other hand, had aligned himself with Zhong Ji-tang, the new governor of Guangdong. Zhon had done a great deal to develop the province, building factories, paved streets, commercial centres and the likes. But he also began to listen to the teachings of Hu Hanmin, who was part of the Western Hills Group, a right-wing branch of the KMT, which disagreed with communism obviously, but also Chiang centrism, who in fact advocated for resistance against the Japanese, warlords, and the self-proclaimed leader Chiang Kai-shek. So even within the KMT, new cliques were beginning to form. The left wing and the old allies of Wang Jingwei, the Western Hills Group on the right, and the CC clique in the centre who supported Chiang. The right wingers actually formed a new government in Guangzhou and were about to start a new civil war just before the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. But instead of starting a new war, they invited Li Zhongreng back, and together they decided to oppose Chiang almost by example, developing the province even further. Plus, Feng, the Christian warlord, would arrive back in his old territories and form the Chaha People's Anti-Japanese Army. This army was set up to stop further Japanese advances, which began in 1933 in the eastern end of the Great Wall. There, ever since the Boxer Rebellion, the Japanese were allowed to station 200 men. Then, on New Year's Day, they threw grenades and fired their rifles, again faking another assault and starting another skirmish. This began the Battle of Reihei, a province which lay in between the Great Wall and Manchuria, and a province the Japanese argued belonged to their new puppet state. By March, the Japanese had captured the capital and then launched assault after assault on the wall, some of which the Chinese fought off with swords. These swords, by the way, were the Dao, and they would still be used throughout the Second World War. First, if you're interested in World War II and military history, well, let me introduce you to War Thunder, the most comprehensive combat game ever made. In this game you can play more than 2,000 tanks, helicopters and ships in dynamic combined arms PvP battles. The collection of vehicles span over 100 years of development, from the 1920s to the present day. As you'd expect though, I'm far more excited about witnessing the vast amount of historic vehicles in War Thunder, and seeing the interactions between air, ground and even naval vehicles. All of this you'll experience in incredible detail, with 4K resolution, along with authentic sound effects and beautiful music. War Thunder also has dynamic and detailed vehicle damage models, with Damage X-Ray showing you exactly what damage has been affected to you or even your opponent's vehicles. You will also join these intense PvP battles at various immersion levels for all playstyles, so you can have a fast action-packed match, or if you'd prefer, a more realistic and tactical experience. Every vehicle in War Thunder is incredibly detailed, and modelled down to their individual components, offering a highly immersive combat experience. So come and play War Thunder free now on PC, Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 5, or any of the previous console generations. And for those who sign up on PC using my link, there is even a large free bonus pack, which will include multiple premium vehicles, a premium account, boosters, and much more. So sign up today, and I'll see you out there on the battlefield. But for now, let's get back to China. So the Chinese were obviously outgunned, but they had decades ago created the Dare to Die Corps, who, as the name suggests, were suicide soldiers. These soldiers developed an early suicide vest and, just like later suicide bombers, sacrificed their lives to blow up Japanese officers, tanks and the likes. But still the Japanese won, and the Tangu Truce was signed in 1933, as China ceded the territory north of the Great Wall to Japan. Yet Japanese expansion didn't end there. In fact, during the fighting, they had sent collaborators into Johor. They believed this would divert Chinese forces towards the region, but they found no resistance. So the 3,000 collaborators continued. It was during this campaign that Feng formed the anti-Japanese army, who, alongside Mongols and Manchurian bandits, delayed the Japanese advance eventually. But Chiang Kai-shek feared the creation of this autonomous army, declared it was full of communists, and cut off train services to the region. Chiang then decided to attack Feng, forcing him to resign from politics completely. So obviously the resistance began to crumble, generals swapped sides and back again, and the Japanese advanced. So in September 1933, the Mongolian princes of Johor and Sui Yuan met and decided to create a pan-Mongolian self-rule movement. Under a new leader, Prince Day, they sent word to Chiang of their new autonomous rule, but this new leadership would soon fall under the control of Japan as well. However, the creation of any pan-Mongolian state would be difficult, as the Soviets had helped the communists seize power in Outer Mongolia. There were rebellions in 1932, started by Buddhists who believed they would get the support of the Panchen Lama or the Japanese, but this failed, and the Stalinist-style purges continued there. But we'll come back to Mongolia later, as the Japanese had plans elsewhere in Xinjiang. There the KMT and Ma clique had been battling Jin Chunren. But also in 1933, Jin died, leaving Shen Shikai as his successor. He, however, by this point was on the defensive, as Ma Zhongyin chased him back to Urumqi. But both sides were committing terrible atrocities during this conflict. Sometimes Han Chinese would convert to Islam on news of the Ma clique's advances. People were slaughtered based on their ethnicity, villages were destroyed, and bodies were left to rot for weeks. So the local Uyghurs, who were left largely trapped in the middle of this Han-Hui Muslim conflict, created the East Turkestan Republic. This was heavily influenced by the Jadid intellectuals from Russian Central Asia, many of which had actually begun to fight against the Soviets during the Basmachi movement. and the two groups could have united to form a pan-Turkic state. The leader of East Turkestan was Muhammad Amin Bugra, who implemented Sharia law and almost formed an alliance with Japan. But the Japanese may have had other plans, as an exiled Ottoman prince had arrived in Tokyo. There was talk of installing him as a puppet ruler of East Turkestan, and thus a larger pan-Turkic puppet state. So Japanese weapons began arriving in the area. However, many feared the creation of a Muslim Manchukuo, including Ataturk of Turkey and the Soviet Union. But the East Turkestan rebels also got some support from Afghanistan as well, and many local Kyrgyz people joined their side, setting up a very complicated three-way war. Shen, supported by the Soviets with White Russians in his army, the KMT and the Marklik, and East Turkestan, supported by Afghanistan and the Japanese. The Battle of Kashgar was perhaps the most complicated, as the city changed hands numerous times in 1933. There, even many present had no real idea who was massacring who, or who the various groups were siding with. Meanwhile, the Marklik besieged Urumqi. But Soviet troops rushed to Shen's aid and chased them away. Many Ma soldiers fled south towards the East Turkestan Republic and captured it in 1934. So, as Shen chased Ma soldiers east, the south was now ruled over by Ma Hushan, loyal to the KMT. He would go on to crush further rebellions in 1935, but we'll leave Xinjiang as the rest of China was going through trouble throughout 1934 and 35. Like back in Inner Mongolia, there was the North Johar incident, a very minor incident which saw the Chinese arrest Japanese soldiers travelling without permits. This, however, resulted in the Chindoy-Hara Agreement, and all Chinese forces were ordered to leave Johar. In the vacuum left behind, the Japanese began to send soldiers and weapons to the Inner Mongolians, gradually turning them into a puppet. Chiang Kai-shek, however, was still more focused on the communists within his own borders. He began to launch ever larger encirclement campaigns, and they began in 1933. This time, however, they were far more effective, thanks in part to the advice of Nazi generals and the revival of Sino-German cooperation. Germany was a pretty obvious choice for Chiang to ally with. For starters, he desperately needed help, as the Soviets and Japanese were slowly encircling him. But also, ever since World War I, Germany had no colonies, and therefore no ambition to take their land. Plus, whereas the Soviets required communist involvement in the government to receive support, the Germans required no such thing. Their cooperation had actually begun in 1926, when Max Bauer arrived, but really back then, the German military was still constrained by the Treaty of Versailles, so no real help would have been possible. But then the Nazis took over in 1933, and almost immediately, Hans von Seeckt arrived in Shanghai. He believed Chiang should do away with the large armies in China and focus on a small but well-trained army. And they should also focus on building their own weapons. Chiang agreed with the latter at least, and in 1934 signed a trade deal with the Germans. In exchange for raw materials, German businesses would help set up these factories. Again, this made quite a lot of sense, as China could really not engage in much international trade given their huge debts. Von Seeckt eventually left and was replaced by Alexander von Falkenhausen, and under his watch, China began to grow rapidly thanks to German aid. Railway lines were built to major cities like Guizhou, so the Germans could ship out raw materials faster, but these railway lines would be crucial in the war to come. Then, with the 3-year plan, which was introduced in 1936, China was set to have a centralized industrial system, with major steelworks, all backed up with over 100 million Reichsmarks in loans. The Hanyang arsenal was also reconstructed, allowing China to produce mortars, Maxim guns, artillery, and the Chiang Kai-shek rifle, which was based on the German Mauser. On top of that, 80,000 Chinese soldiers were being trained by the Germans, and the German advisors would recommend tactics China would later use, like using the Yellow River for defense, developing guerrilla fighters, and preparing to fight a war of attrition rather than attack and lose all of those well-trained soldiers. Over in Germany, some still favoured sticking with China over Japan, like Göring, who apparently told H.H. Kung, the Chinese finance minister, that Japan couldn't be trusted, and China would one day be a mighty power. so a possible military alliance was on the cards, and the Germans helped the Chinese plan to encircle the communists once and for all. Beginning in late 1933, blockhouses were set up to help enforce the KMT's position, and slowly they began to defeat the communist counterattacks. Then, in 1934, communist spies reported that Chiang was about to launch a huge offensive on the now depleted communist forces. So a plan was made to escape. Some diverted the KMT, while the main communist leaders and just under 86,000 soldiers attempted to break through the lines. They broke through via the blockhouses that were controlled by Chong Ji-tang, a leader they rightly assumed was more concerned about preserving his own men. Among the group that broke through was Mao, Zhou Enlai, and many of the future leaders of Communist China. But there was also Otto Braun, a German communist who was advising them on behalf of the Soviet Union. This group proceeded to march into Guangdong, then Hunan. However, to get this far, they had to pass through a series of fortifications, and only 36,000 were able to make it, whether through desertion or military action. And now they had to decide where to go. It was Mao who suggested Guizhou, and Zhou Enlai agreed, overruling Braun and Bogu. So they marched west and captured Junyi in early 1934, yet by now they only had 10,000 men. Within the city, a meeting was held to discuss the causes behind such losses. A Politburo was formed to listen to the speeches of the main leaders, and Mao's analysis of the situation won the day. At the end of it, Bo Braun and even Zhou Enlai were stripped of much of their power. So, with Mao gaining back all of his lost power, he successfully led his men away from Chiang's attacks. It was almost a game of cat and mouse, as Mao marched through Yunnan, Sichuan, and on to Tibet. Yunnan I've not mentioned in this episode, but it was still under the leadership of Long Yun, who continued to develop his region almost independently, while Guizhou had been ruled over by Wang Jilai, who often resisted Chiang's centralization attempts. So after the Red Army were able to walk through his region, Chiang used this as an excuse to march in, bribe local officials, and depose him. Then, as they marched through Sichuan, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the local warlords to attack them. But Sichuan still had a number of powerful warlords vying for power, and it had been in a state of civil war for years. Two of the most powerful warlords were Liu Xiang and his uncle Liu Wenhui. Wenhui would actually allow the communists to pass through his territory peacefully. However, he in turn would be ousted by his nephew temporarily before being allowed to return to control the opium-producing regions in the border of Tibet. Wenhui and other warlords in Sichuan, like Deng Shihao, would later defect to the communists, while Yang Sen and others fled to Taiwan with the KMT after the Civil War. So Sichuan had remained divided for decades. As for the communists, they were finally able to cross the Yangtze after winning a battle at Luding Bridge in Tibet. But here they came into a conflict with rebelling Tibetans known as the Khampa. They had formed the Tibetan Improvement Party, which aimed at modernizing the country and ending feudalism. But their plans were discovered and many fled the country, meeting the communists and even later Liu Wenhui in 1934. Mao won these battles and proceeded north, where he met up with other communist troops. The first armies he met were led by Zhang Guotao. He had fled the Soviet he controlled, but his escape route was far more direct, and hence he had far more troops. He in fact controlled an army of 80,000 men, and could have actually looked to gain more control. He began to argue with Mao over where to go next, as he favoured the west, but Mao chose the north. So the two armies split again. Zhang's forces arrived in the territory of the Ma clique, where they were decimated, and the remnants of his armies returned to Mao. There was in fact another army which set off from Hebei, led by He Long. He had led his armies through the Tibetan mountains until he too met up with Mao, and together they marched into Shaanxi province, ending the Long March. So the communists had survived, but membership had fallen from around 300,000 to 40,000, and just a few thousand soldiers formed their army. But nevertheless, Mao had finally become the almost undisputed leader of the party. Zhou Enlai was made his number 2, and Deng Xiaoping was the vice chairman. And now they were in the mountains around Jiannan, They created the myth about the Long March, attracted peasants to their cause through their policies, and rebuilt their armies. So Chiang still couldn't fully unite his own country, and as this was going on, the Japanese continued on their advance. In 1936, the Mongolian princes met with the Japanese, and the Mongol military government was formed. They were sent a number of weapons, and Chinese collaborators in the Grand Han Righteous Army were sent to help bolster their armies. Together they started the invasion of Sui Yuan later in the year, but without Japanese troops in the field, they were crushed. By now it was quite clear to many that Japan was the main threat, and many disagreed with Chiang's policy on focusing on communists and internal affairs. In fact, Chiang Kai-shek was even starting further problems elsewhere, as in the south, Hu Hanmin had died, and Chiang wanted a man loyal to him to take over Guangdong. Chun Ji-tang obviously disagreed with this and planned to move against Chiang Kai-shek, but the politics of the country had now changed. He could no longer get supporters in a civil war, so he fled to Hong Kong. Li Jongren and Bai Chong-si, who had actually sided with Chen, decided to make peace, and were largely left to govern over the south. But this event was almost an omen for things to come for Chiang. One man who disagreed with his focus on civil wars was Zhang Zuelang, the former ruler of Manchuria. He had spent the 30s trying to stop his addiction to opium, and even had an affair with Mussolini's daughter. But in 1936, he asked Chiang Kai-shek to come to Xi'an to talk to soldiers. Once there though, Chiang was arrested by the soldiers while he slept and brought before Jiang. Many wanted Chiang Kai-shek to be killed, but Jiang refused, as he had another plan. He had also invited communists to the city to discuss an end to the fighting. Chiang Kai-shek was obviously reluctant, and many in the capital began discussing the possibility of declaring war on Jiang and moving on to Xi'an. But before any of this could happen, Chiang Kai-shek relented. His life was on the line, so he ordered an end to the civil war and a refocus of attention onto Japan. This, the Xi'an incident, came just in time, as in 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident would start the Second Sino-Japanese War. In 1936, Chiang Kai-shek was arrested by Zhang Zueliang and forced to make peace with the communists. Jiang did this to make sure that the country was united against the Japanese, who, by this point, had already taken over Manchuria and set up a puppet government in Inner Mongolia. Chiang reluctantly agreed, but he was still vehemently anti-communist. In fact, there had been a growing number of fascists within his KMT party called the Blue Shirts. They had some success in pushing for reforms, notably the New Life movement. This could maybe be compared to Mao's later Cultural Revolution, which looked to completely revolutionize Chinese society. This movement promoted qualities like orderliness, cleanliness, simplicity, and precision. And they said that people should refrain from eating loudly, spitting, urinating, and even sneezing in public. But to enforce the policies, the Blue Shirts began to attack people in the streets and, generally, turned people away from their ideas. Even Chiang began to believe that he had made a mistake in aligning with the group, saying, "How would I differ from the communists if I were to imitate the so-called fascists of Italy?" So the New Life movement began to collapse, and so too did the Blue Shirts, who, by 1937, only had a couple hundred members left. And this is when war finally came. When it did, most of the warlords of China continued their ties with the KMT, with a couple of exceptions. Like there was Shen Shikai in Xinjiang, and Long Yun of Yunnan. He claimed to join the war and would later send some troops there, but in reality, he spent a lot of the war building up his own region instead. Meanwhile, over in Japan, Fumimaro Konoe had become Prime Minister in mid-1937. However, the army, which had so far largely acted independently, had taken over many positions within the government. In the government, many were therefore pushing for war, while just outside Beijing, Japanese troops began to clash with the Chinese. These troops had been allowed to remain there ever since the Boxer Rebellion, controlling the route to Tianjin. Well, on July 7th, the soldiers conducted exercises around Wanping, just outside of Beijing. The two groups fired at one another, and a Japanese soldier went missing. The Japanese demanded that they should be allowed to search the town for the soldier, but this was denied. So the next day the Japanese mobilized their men and attacked. The missing soldier by this point had already been found, and he allegedly just got lost going to the toilet at night. But the Japanese still attacked, crossing the Marco Polo Bridge to attack Wanping. The Chinese, suffering heavy losses, agreed to apologize and remove their army from the town. During the ceasefire though, both sides continued to move troops to the region. So fighting erupted again, this time south of the city in late July. Another ultimatum was sent, demanding that the Chinese withdraw to the west of the Yongding River, but this was rejected, so the Japanese struck at Beijing itself. There was some hope for the Chinese early on, as collaborators in the East Herpei army mutinied on the 29th. This however drummed up further anti-Chinese sentiment in Japan, and that same day, their navy attacked Tianjin. The following day, the leader of the Chinese forces, Song Jae-yuan, was ordered to retreat, and the Japanese were able to take over the city by the end of the month. But over in Japan, Prime Minister Konoe decided to open negotiations with Chiang, saying, "Japan wants Chinese cooperation, not Chinese land." However, on August 9th, a Japanese officer was shot in Shanghai. The great powers stepped in to try to negotiate a peace, but the Japanese demanded Chinese troops leave the city. So talks once again broke down, and the Battle of Shanghai began a couple days later. This, however, was not such a quick victory for the Japanese, and the battle descended into house-to-house fighting. Meanwhile, in the north, 200,000 Japanese troops advanced onto Taiyuan, and their Mongolian allies moved west onto Chahar. The ruler of Shaanxi, Yan Xishan, called on the communists for help, but the 8th Route Army largely avoided direct confrontation and launched guerrilla attacks instead. Yan's forces meanwhile did put up fierce resistance, like at the battles of Jingkou and eventually Taiyuan in October, where they killed over 50,000 Japanese soldiers. But Yan lost over 200,000 men defending his region. This was the majority of his forces, and he was forced to retreat. In fact, as the Japanese did try to mop up the communist guerrillas, they offered peace to Yan if he broke from Chiang Kai-shek. However, he refused. In Shanghai, the battle continued. German advisors like von Falkenhausen advised Chiang that the city must be held at all cost, and Chiang agreed. Chiang believed that he would be more likely to receive foreign support if he could demonstrate his army stood a chance of winning the war. Then in September they appealed to the League of Nations, but the League, like elsewhere, did very little. There was also the Nine Power Conference, which met in November to discuss possible actions, but once again, nothing came from it. Plus, holding on to the city for so long caused immense problems. Constant bombings forced nearly 1 million civilians to seek refuge in the small foreign concessions, and Chiang had sent in his German-trained divisions. There were only around 80,000 or so of these troops, and around 60% of them were lost. Plus, their small armoured groups were all but wiped out, and nearly half of the officers trained at the Whampoa Academy were killed. This obviously weakened the larger Chinese resistance, and all the pre-war modernization efforts had come to nothing. But also, there was another problem, as Chiang would now have to rely on warlords to provide soldiers and officers. Shanghai then eventually fell in late November. But it did require 300,000 Japanese troops to take it, and somewhere between 20 and 50,000 of these troops were lost. The Chinese obviously suffered more in these initial battles, and particularly in the north, soldiers were sent to the front with antiquated weapons including swords. But these were still substantial losses for the much smaller Japanese army. After the Battle of Shanghai was concluded, the Japanese marched on Nanking. An old enemy of Chiang Kai-shek, Tang Shengsi, stepped in to lead the defense of the city. But the defenses quickly crumbled, and the city fell in mid-December. What followed was one of the most infamous episodes of the war, the Rape of Nanking. However, there was some precedent to this. Like in Shanghai, one Japanese soldier recounted, "We'd take all the men behind the houses and kill them with bayonets and knives. Then we'd lock up the women and children in a single house and rape them at night. Then, before we left in the morning, we'd kill all the women and children, and to top it off, we'd set fire to the houses." This killing continued all the way to Nanking, when Prince Asaka was placed in control of the army. Around 300,000 Chinese were encircled in the city, and there was a possibility to discuss their surrender, but Prince Asaka ordered that they should kill all the captives. So, after the Japanese entered the city, the population suffered from all sorts of horrors. They buried people alive, bayoneted children, raped tens of thousands of women, and they even forced family members to rape one another. Japanese newspapers even reported on a contest between officers to kill, although most likely just behead, Chinese soldiers with their swords. The number of people killed throughout December and into January was around 200,000. Many in Japan were actually outraged by this event, not so much because of the horrors, but rather repetition of this would risk antagonizing the Chinese further. So to try and stop this from happening again, they decided to create comfort stations for the soldiers. However, this would involve shipping hundreds of thousands of women from Korea, Manchukuo and Taiwan to fill them up. And later they would forcibly take women from Indochina, Malaysia and the rest of their occupied territories to service the Japanese army. Yet, as all this was going on, there were some prospects for an early peace mediated by the Germans, who still at this point had close ties to both countries. Oskar Trautmann, the Nazi ambassador, handed a list of demands to the Chinese, including autonomy for Inner Mongolia, demilitarization of Shanghai, and cooperation between the two countries to combat communism. Chiang had accepted this back when the Battle of Shanghai was still ongoing, but Japanese hardliners changed their demands once the battle had been won, and now they demanded recognition of Manchukuo and war reparations. This demonstrates that in Tokyo at least, the Prime Minister was not so keen on expanding the war and conquering all of China. He, after all, like many others, still saw the Soviet Union as their greatest threat. So deploying more troops south would risk an invasion of Manchuria, plus the army had for a long time pushed for a strike against the Soviets, seizing resources in the east of their country and eliminating the threat once and for all. But Tokyo had all but lost control of their army, and their next target was Suzhou, which, if they took it, would unite their conquests. Then Shandong quickly fell as Han Fuju retreated to preserve his own units, demonstrating again the warlords of China were not exactly cooperating. But at Taiyuan, just outside of the city of Suzhou, the Japanese were actually defeated in early April. The Chinese here were led by Li Zhongren and Bai Chongxi, and they deployed a number of suicide bombers to strike at the Japanese armoured units. This was the first great victory that the Chinese achieved, and it did a great deal to boost morale, and they also killed somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Japanese soldiers. Yet the Japanese just continued advancing though, hoping to completely encircle the Chinese. During these maneuvers, the Chinese were able to achieve yet another success, encircling 7,000 Japanese troops in Langfeng County in May. But to avoid complete encirclement, Chiang ordered his units retreat and prepared to defend Wuhan. This had been turned into the new capital ever since the fall of Nanking. So when Kaifeng fell to the Japanese, Chiang turned to drastic actions to defend the city. He decided to break the dikes of the Yellow River and cause huge floods. This did slow down the Japanese advance somewhat, but it also caused huge damage to the surrounding region. Although the numbers are again disputed, it is believed around 500,000 people died, or some people say up to 900,000 people died. 3 million people also became refugees, diseases spread, and the survivors were left without homes. Chiang, realizing the unpopularity of such an action, tried to blame the Japanese for the floods. But really, many people began to turn against the KMT. This therefore proved to be a great propaganda victory for the communists, who turned people's anger against both the KMT and the Japanese. Yet it should be said that this flood, which occurred in June, did stop the Japanese from advancing from the north, pushing their whole advance south. And it did kill thousands of Japanese soldiers as well, but how many, it's really hard to tell. Also, the war had been going on for a year at this point, and the Japanese had lost tens of thousands of men, and their lines were already overstretched. After all, they were now having to move further into Chinese territory, while trying to wipe out the communist guerrilla forces behind the front. To try and help out with this, a couple new puppet states were created. Like in Shanghai, they created the Great Wei government. But this was absorbed into the reformed government of China, which was put under the control of Liang Hongzhi. He had been part of the old Anhui clique, and was with its old leader Duan when he died in the Japanese concession of Shanghai in 1936. So these old warlords still existed, and they were still reluctant to join the KMT. So due to previous conflicts and the possibility of restoring power, they joined in with the Japanese. This was also true with Japan's other puppet state, the Provisional Government of China. Here Ji Shi Yuan joined the government, and he was a member of the old Ji clique in previous decades. The Japanese actually hoped to put a more prominent leader in power of this date, like Cao Kun or Wu Peifu, but they either rejected to join or just made too many demands. Instead, Wang Kemin was made the new head of the government, and he was just a banker in Beijing. Then there were of course the other puppet states as well. Prince Day and his Mongolian state continued to build up their army, while in Manchukuo, Puyi was almost left out of politics entirely. He in fact showed signs of sadism with page boys and young women in his court. For instance, when one page boy fled to escape his advances, he had him flogged to death, but then flogged those responsible for killing him as well. And even though he rarely left his palace, outside he was declared a god of sorts, and school children would have to pray to his portrait. This, the Japanese believed, would encourage more collaborators to sacrifice themselves on behalf of a god emperor. And his state of Manchukuo did grow during this time. This was thanks in part to a large number of workers brought into the region. Potentially millions of Chinese were essentially enslaved and forced to work in the growing industries of the region, and thus Manchukuo started to become possibly the richest Chinese province. These slaves, by the way, would also be used in experiments at the notorious Unit 731. Japanese rule of Manchukuo also spelt disaster for many of the ethnic minorities as well, like the Oregon and Hertsen, who were also subject to experiments, random acts of cruelty, mobilization and the likes. So by the end of the war, around 90% of these populations had been killed. But back in China, Chiang Kai-shek did manage to expand his influence somewhat. Liu Xiang had died in 1938, and he had been the leader of Sichuan for years, and had taken part in the battles of Shanghai and Nanking. But it has been suspected that he was poisoned by Chiang because of rumours he was about to align with Han Fuju against him. His death allowed Chiang to all but take over Sichuan for himself, without any intervention from warlords. Mao meanwhile remained in Yan'an. His new armies, the 8th Route Army and the new 4th Army, while conducting some guerrilla attacks, spent a great deal of time recruiting new members into the Communist Party. Elsewhere, Ma Bufang still ruled in the west, and he continued to launch campaigns against the Ungolok Tibetans, destroying their monasteries and all but wiping out their influence from his territories. And in the far west, the Soviets had finally moved into Xinjiang. There, back in the mid-1930s, the Uyghurs tried to create their own country, while the ruler of the province, Chen Shikai, fought against the KMT. The Russians backed Chen Shikai in this fight, and then they pressured him to purge other leaders in the region, including Mahmud Mohuti. He had participated in the last rebellion, but was brought into the new government to try to secure some peace. The Soviets, however, believed he was trying to form an alliance with Japan, while Sheng began to believe he had aligned himself with Ma Hushan, a Muslim general aligned to the KMT. Again, this region was all very complicated. Before Mohuti fled to British India, he sent a letter to Ma Hushan to discuss a possible alliance. Then his departure prompted many Turkic Muslims to rebel against the Soviet-backed government. Soviet planes then bombed the rebels, and in the USSR, Stalin ordered 400 Uyghur students who had been sent to study there executed without a trial. This whole invasion began back in April 1937, while the KMT were too busy preparing for the Japanese invasion. Leaders like Ma Hushan still expected to get support from the KMT, and he made bold claims to his followers, planning a jihad to conquer Russian Turkestan, Siberia, and even the Kremlin itself. But Stalin and Chiang Kai-shek then signed a non-aggression pact. The Soviets even began sending weapons to the Chinese as part of Operation Z, which included bombers, tanks, and anti-aircraft. However, given the lack of infrastructure, much of this had to be brought in on camels. But while the pact was being signed, the Soviets moved into Xinjiang in October. Their soldiers, supported by planes, crushed the rebellion, while the Battle of Shanghai was already underway. So Chiang Kai-shek could do nothing, and during this invasion, the influential leader Ma Zhongying disappeared. But reports differ on what actually happened. Back to the front lines though. In the summer of 1938, the Japanese finally moved on Wuhan. Although outnumbered by about 4-1, the Japanese were able to almost encircle the city. Then they used chemical weapons on the defenders, so the city was abandoned by October. The Chinese capital once again moved, this time to Chongqing. So, once again, the Japanese had failed to strike a decisive blow, knocking the Chinese out of the war. The now depleted Japanese forces paused for a few months, while, in Japan, the National Mobilization Law drafted most of the people into their armies or industries. Elsewhere, though, they actually made some advances. Like back in May, their troops landed in Fuzhou, Xiamen, and Shantou. This was aimed at targeting supplies arriving in China and bolstering their armies. Then that October they struck at Guangzhou and entered the city almost unopposed, as the Chinese were able to set large sections of the city ablaze before retreating. The Japanese next moved on to Hainan Island in February 1939. But really all of this success did little to stop supplies coming in, as they still arrived via Indochina, India and Russia overland. On the main front, Japanese reinforcements began to arrive in early 1939, and with these they were able to seize Nanchang that May. But to the north they failed to take over Suzhou around the same time. Importantly though, the Chinese were able to take back some land, and lost a very similar amount of men to the Japanese during these battles, around 20,000 or so, showing that the tide of war had actually turned just 2 years in. The Japanese were having even worse luck far in the north. They had lost the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol with Russia, and although this was just a border skirmish, it changed quite a lot. For starters, it, along with the failures in China, demonstrated the Japanese army would be unable to carry out their northern strike into Russia. This was made even worse when Germany and Russia signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939. This meant that the Soviets could, in theory, prepare for a strike on Japanese territories. So to try and end the war in China, the Japanese assaulted Changsha in September. This, however, ended in failure, and the Japanese would never be able to capture the city during the war. So they once again turned to cutting off supplies arriving in China, and in November 1939 they landed in South Guangxi. Their advance further inland was halted, but this campaign left the only routes into China overland. With all of these Japanese failures, the Chinese began to believe that they could launch a huge counterattack across all fronts, reclaiming land from their now depleted enemy. Although they did attack on all fronts, their main goal was Wuhan. Yet they really didn't have the weapons to break through the Japanese lines, and this, the winter offensive, only resulted in little changes on the ground. However, it did come as a shock to the world that China was actually in a position to mount a counterattack. And sensing an opportunity to keep the Japanese occupied elsewhere, the Allied powers agreed to loan China money and send them even more weapons. Plus, later in 1940, there were other Chinese advances as well, with the Communists' 100 Regiments offensive. The Communists by this point had already been accused of not contributing enough to the war effort, and instead just focused on expanding their own army. And in some regards this is correct. In late 1939, they had around 90,000 soldiers, but this had grown to around 200,000 by the next year, divided, as the name suggests, into 100 regiments. So this offensive was a way to mend relations with the KMT and bolster their own image among the population. They weren't necessarily huge offensives, but more like guerrilla attacks running from August to December that year, during which they were able to kill around 20 or so thousand Japanese and collaborators, and they blew up hundreds of kilometers of railway lines, destroyed around 100 bridges, cut down over 1,000 cable posts, and brought some plants and mines to a standstill temporarily. In response, the Japanese adopted scorched earth tactics, which they called the Three Alls policy, hoping to root out the communists. They would kill all, burn all, and loot all within the areas that the communists operated in northern China. Yasuji Okamura was put in charge of this operation, and he put hundreds of thousands of people to work digging defensive lines. He also killed many civilians who he believed were helping the guerrillas in hiding. Again, chemical weapons were used, and random acts of violence were commonplace. So some historians believe that in these regions, up to 2.5 million people were killed, making it far worse than something like the rape of Nanking, but often a forgotten piece of history. The Japanese also brought together their Chinese puppet states into the reorganized national government, and Wang Jingwei was made the new puppet ruler. To understand how he found his way here though, we have to go back a bit. He was originally part of the left-wing branch of the KMT and called for collaboration with Mao early on, but he began to turn away from the communists after political failures. He then voiced opposition to joining Hitler's anti-Soviet pact and also didn't want Soviet aid either. He began to see all European powers as imperialist. So while Chiang was happy to receive any aid, Wang wanted China to be able to build itself up. To this extent he began to turn more right-wing. But, possibly more important, he wasn't optimistic about China's chances in a war with Japan. So in 1938 he fled to French Indochina, and there he actually survived another assassination attempt as the KMT tried to silence him. After this he flew to Shanghai, began talks with the Japanese, and became the new puppet ruler. But he was given very real little power or support. So to try and drum up his own support, Wang portrayed himself as the true successor to Sun Yat-sen, often playing on Sun's Pan-Asian ideals. That same year, Japan also played on these ideals, with the creation of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Manchukuo Mengjiang and Wang Jingwei obviously joined this, but the Japanese still had plans to create other puppet states in China. For instance, around this time, Yan Zishang debated switching over allegiances. He, after all, like many, had studied in Japan and had connections in the Japanese army. Plus, he also began to despise the communists. However, nothing came of this. So the Japanese looked elsewhere to find an ally among the Muslim generals in the West. For instance, they approached Ma Hongquei of Ningxia, but he refused. The Ma clique and many Muslims had fought to defend China ever since the Boxer Rebellion, and they were determined to continue the fight. Ma Hongquei even arrested the Mongol leader Darijaya, believing that he was about to switch sides. Muslim leaders like Hu Songshang were instrumental in drumming up support among the population. He actually told Muslims to salute the Chinese flag during morning prayers, and created his own prayer. Protect us from the evil deeds done by the violent Japanese. They have occupied our cities and killed our people. Send upon them a furious wind, cause their airplanes to fall in the wilderness, and their battleships to sink in the sea. But, had things gone differently, the route to Xinjiang would have been open, and maybe Japan could look again at helping to create the East Turkestan state. They already had agents in the region, especially around Hami, and in 1939 they had established contacts with Tibet as well. Jinzo Nomoto had spent years studying Mongolian, so he just pretended to be a Mongolian to travel through into Tibet. This was mainly an intelligence gathering mission rather than a diplomatic mission though, and it could have been part of a larger plan to set up ties with the Afghans. This means the Muslim generals like Ma Hongquei had essentially stopped China from being completely surrounded. And although small in comparison, the Battle of West Wei Yan in 1940 ended Japan's plans further inland. So by this point, Japan began to turn their attention elsewhere. Supplies were still arriving in China via Vietnam, but in 1940, France had fallen, and Japan sent an ultimatum to the governor of Indochina, Georges Catroux, demanding he close off the supply routes. He actually agreed to this, but the Japanese just demanded more and more, showing that they were set on invading. This invasion occurred in September 1940, when they crossed the border and occupied the entire region. For a little while, even the British agreed to close off their roads into China after the Japanese pressured them as well. But the Burma Road was later reopened. Yet with the fall of Indochina, the Japanese signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviets and began to turn away from China entirely. In 1941 there were a few offensives, but they all ended in failure. Mainly though, their country was suffering from a lack of resources and they needed oil, rubber and a great deal more. So the government began to listen to the Navy, and they adopted the Southern Strike Doctrine, attacking Dutch East Indies, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Hawaii and more. This initially gave them the resources they needed, but now they were at war with the Allies. So after the Japanese failed to take Changsha a couple more times, the front in China continued in a stalemate. The Chinese, on the other hand, had problems of their own, as the united front between the communists and the nationalists had collapsed. Chiang and the other nationalist leaders realised the problems with aligning with the communists, and to understand this, we need to go back in time a bit. Even though the Japanese had conquered the northeast, there were still some small holdouts, like just outside of Shanghai. This was held by the KMT, while the communists set up a base in Yangzhong just nearby. The communist New Fourth Army back in 1940 clashed with the nationalists in Huangqiao and overran their position. This was just a small battle, but it put the communists in the best position to recruit people in one of the most populous parts of the country. So Chiang ordered that the communists should retreat north of the Yangtze River. This, however, was ignored, so Chiang ambushed the new Fourth Army in the town of Maolin in 1941. Many of the reports disagree over why the demand was ignored and even who fired the first shots, but this was essentially the end of the United Front. The communists quickly rebuilt the new Fourth Army and began to recruit even more people into their ranks, working behind enemy lines, often portraying Chiang and the KMT as treasonous for fighting their fellow Chinese during the war. Civil war was largely avoided though, thanks to the USSR and the USA, who stepped in to dissuade both sides. Yet for Mao, saving his base in Yan'an, still had problems of his own. For starters, there were still other prominent leaders who could challenge his power, and many of these were preferred by the Soviet Union, like Wang Ming or other Russian-trained communists. Plus, the Communist Party had spread across northern China. This left thousands of people outside of his central control, and they could become a threat. So he launched the Yan'an Rectification movement. In short, he advocated thought reform in schools to gain an army of young and loyal followers. Alongside this, struggle sessions were introduced. This was when party members would accuse others of being anti-revolutionaries, liberals, nationalist spies and the likes. Plus, by having such a loyal group of followers following the party line, Mao could completely decentralize his control, leaving his loyal supporters to keep the other party members in check. This was completely different to Stalin's approach in the USSR, as he relied on the KGB and the likes. Mao also deviated from the Soviet Union in ideology as well. For instance, he long favoured peasantry over city workers as a base for support. But in 1942, the idea of Mao Zedong thought began to appear in newspapers, or in other words, Maoism was born. One man who was crucial to Mao's success was Kang Sheng. He had trained in Russia and returned with one tactic which he used as the head of Mao's early secret police. This was the use of torture to gain confessions, which usually included an accusation against other party members. So although they didn't follow Soviet philosophy exactly, they did use their tactics. And it should be said that the communists did not take so many casualties in comparison to the KMT. Even Zhou Enlai admitted in his report to Stalin in 1940, saying only 3% of the total casualties were communists. So Mao was buying time and using the war to bolster his own position. Some historians like Endo Homare even point out that Mao, through spies like Pan Hanian, had some connections to the Japanese. He allegedly proposed truces with their puppet governments and planned on stretching out the war for as long as possible. This could be somewhat backed up by Mao's future actions when he thanked the Japanese for the war itself. Like in 1956, he said, "You are also our gentlemen, and we want to thank you. It is really you who have fought this war, educated the Chinese people, and united the scattered Chinese people, so we should be grateful to you." But going back to the front, the Japanese made plans to move into Sichuan in 1942, but this never happened, as Japan by this point had just become too overstretched. Yet they still heavily bombed Chongqing. These bombings began back in 1938 and continued for 5 years. Over 30,000 people were killed during them, and over 30,000 buildings were destroyed. To make matters worse, around Henan, harvests failed in 1942. Much of the remaining food was being taken by the Japanese and Chinese troops that divided the region, so a famine ensued. This killed hundreds of thousands of people, and the survivors resorted to cannibalism and selling their own children. As the war slowly began to turn against Japan in the Pacific, they turned back to Southeast Asia to finally cut off Chinese supplies for good. They marched into Burma through Thailand, which had already joined the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. From here they threatened British India and Yunnan. So many Chinese participated in the defense of Burma, but the Allied command in this area was somewhat disjointed. Joseph Stilwell, for instance, was an American who arrived in China and tried to help lead the war effort, but he believed the British were just trying to protect their colony in India, while Chiang just wanted to hoard US weapons to later fight against the communists. Plus, Chiang Kai-shek met with Indian leaders like Gandhi and expressed his support for their independence movement. So all sides were looking out for their own interests. Nevertheless, there was an unexpected morale boost for the Chinese, as volunteer American pilots, the Flying Tigers, arrived in China after the fall of Burma. Plus, even though Burma fell, supplies still came in via the hump. This saw material airlifted from northeast India over the Himalayas and into Kunming. So throughout 1943, the fighting was conducted along the borders of Burma and China. The Japanese could never break through the lines fully though, and move up into Yunnan. So to try and help draw the Chinese troops away from Southeast Asia, they attacked Chengde, and although they captured the city, they soon had to withdraw. The KMT though were now getting somewhat overconfident. After years of little movement, they turned west to Xinjiang. Chiang Kai still ruled there, but even back in 1942, KMT soldiers began to move to their borders. This they were able to do because the Soviets at that point were fighting against the Nazis. While the Battle of Stalingrad was raging, Chiang Kai tried to sever ties with the Soviets, as he himself was not really a communist. So he hoped to mend relations with the KMT and remove the communist threat to his rule. Chiang demanded that the Soviets retreat, and he arrested Mao's younger brother, Mao Zemin, who had been in the region for years. Under torture, Mao's brother revealed that there was a communist plot to remove him from power. So by mid-1943, the Soviets were forced to leave, and Chiang invited the KMT to fill his country. However, when the tide of war turned, Chiang tried to appeal to the Soviets once more, arresting KMT members and asking Stalin for help. Obviously, no help came, so Chiang Kai stepped down. But the Soviets found a new ally in the old East Turkestan rebels. Many of them had fled to Russia after their failed rebellions, and in 1944, their Ili National Army crossed the border alongside Russian troops. At the same time, a Kazakh named Osman Batur had been rebelling against the rulers of Xinjiang for a couple of years. In Altai he was elected Khan, and the Soviets saw another possible alliance here. So the KMT sent Ma Bufang to deal with the Kazakhs and the Uyghurs who were rebelling. But again, things get complicated in Xinjiang. Not all the East Turkestan rebels supported this new rebellion. Even the old leader, Mohammad Amin Bugla, argued against the Soviet intervention. So now hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops were in Burma and Xinjiang. While on the main front, spies revealed that the Japanese were planning a huge counterattack. Chiang, however, ignored this, believing the stalemate which had been in place since 1940 would continue. But he was wrong, and in April 1944, Operation Ichigo began. 500,000 Japanese soldiers attacked from the north and south, and overwhelmed the Chinese in many towns like Luoyang and Changsha. By the time the Japanese arrived in Guilin late in the year, many Chinese just retreated without fighting, their morale completely shaken. By the end of the year, 750,000 Chinese were left dead, and this defeat was so bad that Stilwell tried to get Roosevelt to send an ultimatum to Chiang, demanding that he should be put in control of the Chinese army. This was of course rejected, but it showed a shift in foreigners' attitudes towards the KMT and communist parties. Many now saw the KMT as corrupt and ineffective. Brooks Atkinson, for instance, wrote, "The KMT was an anti-democratic regime that is more concerned with maintaining its political supremacy than in driving the Japanese out of China." He would actually visit Yan'an and wrote an article titled "Yan'an, a Chinese Wonderland City," where he described Maoism as the best system for China, as it was an agrarian or peasant democracy, or as a farm labour party. Before this, Edgar Snow wrote Red Star over China, portraying Mao as not a communist revolutionary, but rather a progressive force, favouring democracy. And in 1944, the Americans sent the Dixie mission to Yan'an. John Service praised Mao again, comparing him to European socialists and describing him as far less corrupt as the KMT yet again. The US ambassador to China, Clarence Gauss, even said, "Pull the plug and let the whole Chinese government go down the drain." So as the KMT began to crumble, fortunately for them, the war was turning completely against the Japanese elsewhere. But despite this, there was still a final attempt to strike at the Chinese capital of Chongqing. In April 1945, 80,000 or so pushed into the west of Hunan. However, their attack was repulsed. As this battle was going on, Hitler committed suicide, and everybody's attention turned to Japan. On the 6th of August, the Americans dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki, and just 3 days later, Hiroshima was bombed, and the Soviets joined the war in the east and invaded Manchuria. This invasion of Manchuria had been agreed to at the Yalta Conference.
In essence, the Soviets agreed to aid the Allies in the Far East in exchange for some concessions, like Port Arthur, which they had wanted for decades. So 700,000 Soviets crossed the border, all landed in North Korea. They quickly occupied most of the region, and like in Europe, looted a great deal and conducted a series of rapes. Even the Chinese communists appealed to the Soviets to stop, as they didn't discriminate between nationalities. But this was ignored. One of the worst massacres was at Gegenmiao, where both Chinese and Russians attacked Japanese settlers. During this massacre, there are reports of children being sold in markets, and even reports of necrophilia. But the Soviets were still able to capture Puyi before the war officially ended in early September. However, now in China, there would be a race between the communists and nationalists to take over the land left by the Japanese, and China would erupt again into civil war. Somewhere between 20 and 25 million people had died during the war, either through fighting, natural disasters, or famines. Plus, the economy had completely tanked. Compared to prior to the war, it now operated at 20% industrial capacity. To try and make up for the loss of revenue, Chiang and the KMT just began printing money, causing hyperinflation. Currency was actually a huge problem in the immediate aftermath because there were just too many different types. The KMT, for instance, began producing new notes, and there were all of those belonging to the old Japanese puppet states, all of which helped the communists in their propaganda campaigns. At the end of World War II, the Soviets invaded Manchuria, while the Americans dropped nukes on Japan, forcing them to surrender. However, within China, the Japanese and their old puppet rulers still held a considerable amount of land, including Beijing and Nanking. As for these puppet rulers, Puyi had been arrested by the Soviets, Wang Jingwei died before the war ended, and Prince Day, the Mongol ruler, fled to Beijing, where he lived under supervision before later fleeing to Mongolia. So all of this land needed to be recaptured by either the communists or the KMT. The KMT meanwhile were given control over Taiwan, plus Chiang Kai-shek actually had options to expand elsewhere. For instance, during the Cairo Conference in 1943, he wanted the Ryukyu Islands, but these were occupied by the Americans and then in 1971 given back to Japan. However, Roosevelt began to believe that French Indochina should not be handed back to the French, and he threw open the idea of giving the whole region over to China. Chiang allegedly rejected this, but his troops were sent to northern Vietnam to accept the Japanese surrender. These troops remained there until 1946, and they began to work with the VNQ-DD. This was a Vietnamese nationalist party created way back in the 1920s, modelled on and often trained by the KMT. However, Chiang agreed to leave Indochina on the condition that the French hand over their concessions in Shanghai. The French, after all, had already left Guangzhou Wan, so France had ultimately left China altogether. Yet after the Chinese left Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh purged his opponents and began the long war to independence. Just across the border though, in Yunnan, Long Yun had been ruling the province virtually independently. He did however send his armies into Indochina during the war, but this just gave Chiang an opportunity to remove him from power. Late in 1945, the Kunming incident saw Chiang's armies battle Long Yun's for 4 days in the capital city. Long Yun was then escorted to Chongqing and would later flee to Hong Kong. So the KMT were expanding, while the communists, thanks to their guerrilla wars and propaganda campaigns, built an army of over 1.2 million men. But if you were to include the militia forces as well, they could field over 3 million. This army, Mao famously said, ran on nothing but millet plus rifles. However, nearby the communist base, the Soviets had invaded Manchuria and Mengjiang. During this invasion, they set up the Inner Mongolian People's Republic. The communists, fearing this degree of separatism, sent an ethnic Mongolian named Ulanhu to the region, and he was able to disband the government. He would then become the first ruler of the Inner Mongolian Autonomous Region. On the other hand though, the KMT still had around 5 million men, and had been receiving Allied aid throughout the war, including artillery, armoured vehicles and planes. Plus, they had by far the most international support. Although many Americans like Joseph Stilwell favoured cutting ties with Chiang, the Americans continued backing him, providing billions in loans and further military aid. The Soviets too also recognised Chiang, in exchange for him recognising their control over Port Arthur, which was promised to them at Yalta if they invaded Manchuria. But back to the Japanese surrender. Both the Communists and the KMT just ran to grab as much of their occupied land and weapons as they could. Chiang was obviously in a much better position, but he still reached out to Mao to make a deal and invited him to Chongqing in August 1945. Meanwhile, he also ordered that the Japanese soldiers remain in China until the KMT reached them and accepted their surrender. This, however, was routinely ignored, and the Communists were even making their way into Manchuria. So Chiang also called on the Americans to help out, and they landed 50,000 troops in Beijing, occupying it until the KMT could get there. 100,000 KMT troops were then airlifted into the city, but they began looting and forcibly enlisting people to bolster their position in the north. This, along with their economic policies, resulted in yet another breakdown in the economy, as unemployment grew to over 30% in some cities. All of this largely helped Mao, who was still focused on building his peasant army outside of the cities. There were some early clashes, like at Tiananmen, where the Communists attacked a small group of nationalists. And most of these early clashes were won by the more mobile Communist forces, including the Shangdang campaign, which began when Yan Xishan left Shaanxi, hoping to take over cities in Inner Mongolia like Hohhot. This very well could have split up the Communist forces in the east with their base in Yan'an, but the Communists countered and drove him back. Then there was also the Handan campaign, where Liu Bocheng and future leader Deng Xiaoping once again led the Communists to victory. This time they defended a city which lay on the Beijing-Wuhan railway line, allowing the Communists to push further east. As these battles were raging, Chiang and Mao still discussed peace though. Mao was even willing to accept Chiang as president if he was given full control over provinces like Shaanxi and Shandong. But Chiang just thought that this would bring the country back to the warlord era. Eventually though, they signed the Double Tenth Agreement in October. Mao had been pressured into signing this, but he wanted to use the peace to mobilize the masses, to win over the puppet troops, to publish newspapers, and to develop our secret service. Yet in theory this should have put Chiang in control of a united China, and both parties would begin to work together in rebuilding the country. The Americans also sent the Marshall Mission to try and bridge the gap between the two parties, and create a multi-party democracy just in time for an election. However, as MacArthur would later say, it was one of the greatest blunders in American diplomatic history, for which the free world is now paying in blood and disaster. But KMT soldiers were beginning to arrive in major cities, and even the Soviets allowed them to occupy Manchurian cities as well. However, one city was taken by the Communists, and that was the vital city of Qinchao, the pathway to Manchuria. The Communist forces then began to scatter into the countryside, while the KMT advanced into the other cities. However, it became clear to the Soviets that handing over all of Manchuria to the KMT would almost destroy the Communists. This is because since Japanese occupation, it became the most industrial regions in China, and was virtually untouched by the war. And although Stalin sort of supported the KMT at this point, he didn't want the Communists to be completely crushed. So Rodion Malinovsky took the huge stockpiles of Japanese weapons in Manchuria and just handed them over to the Communists. He also began working with the Communists, supplying them with information on where the KMT were going to be at any given time. This information allowed the Communists to move into cities behind the KMT, like Xiping and Harbin, which they captured in early 1946. Also, ever since the Japanese had invaded, there was an army of bandits in Manchuria, the Northeast Anti-Japanese United Army. The Communists, way back in 1936, actually declared that they were a united group, while Kang Sheng kept in limited contact with them. But really, the group had more ties to the Soviet Union, who were trying to tie up the Japanese forces in Manchuria. And although some of these were Communists, the army really consisted of bandits, nationalists, former troops of Zhang Zuoling, and even many Koreans. Many of these Koreans had fled their homeland when Japan annexed their country, including Kim Il-sung. In Manchuria, he even began to achieve some fame for leading attacks on the Japanese, but they were all largely forced to flee to the USSR, where they formed part of the International Brigades. It was there, in Russia, where Kim Jong-il was born, Yuri Urzanovich Kim. However, North Korean history books often say that he was born in a secret military base on the sacred Paektu Mountain. Well, the Kim family was brought back to North Korea to rule over, while his fellow bandits joined in the advancing Communists. In May that year, the Soviets completely left Manchuria, leaving the communists with their Japanese weapons to fill the void. So, just a couple of months later, the peace between the parties completely broke down. Chiang had already been preparing for another war, and to do so he employed a number of Japanese advisors, including Okamura Yasuji. He had killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese, if not a couple million, through scorched earth tactics in northeastern China, trying to root out the communists. But Chiang, like many other high-ranking nationalists, had been trained by the Japanese or even lived there for a time, so he refused to hand him over to the Americans to be tried for war crimes. And there were in fact still thousands of Japanese troops in China, waiting to surrender to either the KMT or the communists. This alliance with Japanese generals was just one of many mistakes made by Chiang. Another was appointing Dai Li to the head of police. He had been in the blue shirt fascist group before the war and was vehemently anti-American. This, along with his other mistakes, stopped American aid flowing in, and some suspect the Americans were actually involved in the plane crash that killed Dai Li in 1946. Nevertheless, in 1946, Chiang decided to attack the communists with a couple million men, spread out across the country. The following year, they achieved a great symbolic victory by capturing Yan'an, the capital of Communist China. Mao and the other high-ranking officials were forced to flee, while Chiang declared victory. He even created a constitution which should have, in theory, created a multi-party democracy. But Chiang's conventional tactics lost him, according to some sources, around 1 million men in this huge assault. The communists, on the other hand, had adopted a passive defensive policy, or, in other words, they were willing to lose territory in order to preserve their forces, retreating into the countryside and the mountains. Once there, they were able to recruit more people by promising land reforms, and by now they were able to field an army of over 5 million men. So they launched 3 offensives, in summer, autumn, and then in winter, gaining ground in Manchuria. And the following year, in 1948, they were ready to begin capturing cities. They laid siege to Changchun for 6 months, and then they moved on Shenyang. In September, in Shandong, over 100,000 communists took Jinan, putting them firmly in control of the region. Millions of communists then embarked on new campaigns in late 1948, moving on Tianjin and Suzhou. Over 150 KMT divisions were wiped out in these campaigns, while the communist losses were just replenished by peasants in new lands. By now then, the communists had essentially linked up their forces, but they still needed Beijing. 200,000 KMT soldiers were still stationed there, but their leader, Fu Zhouyi, agreed to stand down in January 1949. He and his soldiers just defected over to the communists, sparing the city from destruction. Now that the communists owned Beijing, Stalin even stepped in to try and persuade Mao to enter peace negotiations, but this was rejected. While in the KMT, Chiang finally stepped down as leader, leaving Li Zhongren as the head of Nationalist China. He tried to open up peace talks with Mao, but Mao just left him with a list of demands, including repealing the constitution, land reforms, confiscation of property from KMT party elites, and a new coalition government without what he called reactionary elements. Li Zhongren was forced to reject this, so Mao advanced south once again in April. The fleet defending the river and the fortress of Jiangyin defected, allowing the communists to land on the other side. As more began to defect, the communists took over Nanjing without much fighting, and then Shanghai. The KMT fled to Guangzhou, but again they committed serious blunders. Like adopting scorched earth tactics, or when they evacuated Shanghai, they refused to allow civilians to evacuate, leaving them with very little to survive on. So once again, as the communists advanced, many people just joined their cause. In August, the communists moved on Ma Bufang and Ma Honghui in the city of Lanzhou. Outnumbering the defenders 2-1, Mao's forces prevailed. The KMT leaders there flew south to join the rest of the KMT High Command, while the rest of Gansu fell to the communists very quickly. Some KMT leaders even began to withdraw from the mainland, and for the next 4 months, they relocated to Taiwan. And I should mention what was happening in Taiwan during this time. This island had been taken back from the Japanese after decades of their rule. Although there wasn't the same hatred towards the Japanese on the island, the KMT was still welcomed. But back in the 40s, the KMT began to confiscate Japanese-owned factories, mines and homes. And then, Like on the mainland, they poorly managed their economy. Many commodities were shipped over to the mainland to help in the civil war, causing shortages, while those from the mainland were given the best jobs on the island. Tensions began to grow until, in 1947, a 40-year-old woman had her cigarettes confiscated. She was then struck in the head, and this just caused riots to break out. Martial law was declared, and 1,000 locals were killed. The protesters tried to make demands including autonomy, free elections and the likes, while a guerrilla army, the 27 Brigade, was formed. But then more troops came from the mainland and began to crack down on the protesters and, in fact, the population at large. This would set the stage for the White Terror launched by Chiang later on. Chiang would also later take hundreds of millions of dollars to Taiwan, greatly angering Lee Jong-ren, who was still trying to put up a fight. In fact, Lee had refused to go with Chiang to Guangzhou, instead choosing to retreat to Guangxi, but he had no money and a worthless currency. Yan Zishan tried to make the two mend their relations, rightfully believing a divided party could not stop the communists. And Yan, who had already lost his territory of Shaanxi months before, was determined to stop them. However, there were further divides in the KMT, as the Revolutionary Committee of the KMT was set up in 1948. This was led by the likes of Li Zhishen, who wanted to make peace with the communists. Many of Chiang's enemies joined this group, and so too did Sun Yat-sen's widow. Today, in fact, this political party still survives, as one of the only other political parties allowed in China, with over 150,000 members. So with the KMT divided, the communists continued to advance. In October 1949, they took Guangzhou. Thousands of people fled to Hong Kong and Macau, while Chiang took those loyal to him to Sichuan. Both Chiang and Li, who was still in Guangxi, ordered that their own soldiers only defend the lands that they occupied and didn't defend the others. So, as you'd expect, this didn't last long. That same month, Bai Chongxi tried to stop the communists in Guangxi, but he too was defeated, while the governor of Yunnan, Lu Han, just defected. Li fled to the United States and straight to Harry Truman. In a meeting with the president, he called Chiang Kai-shek a traitor and promised that he would return to China to crush Chiang. However, the following month, Chongqing fell, and in December, the new capital of Chengdu followed. So Chiang Kai-shek finally had to flee to Taiwan. Then, when Qinghai was declared a new province of Communist China in January, only Xinjiang lay out of their control. The KMT still held on to most of this region, but the Soviet Union supported the East Turkestan Republic in the north. Then there was also Osman Batayev, who was leading his own rebellion with an army of Kazakhs. He tried to make Altai an independent state, but this turned the Soviet Union against him. The Soviets, along with Choi Bal-san of Mongolia, decided to strike at his forces, so he switched over to the KMT. Together they unsuccessfully raided Mongolian land, but Osman still continued the rebellion. Meanwhile, in Urumqi, Masoud Sabri became head of the KMT state. He was the first Uyghur appointed by the KMT, and it should have encouraged more people to join against the Soviets. After all, many of the old independence fighters rejected the new Soviet puppet state. But once again, riots broke out back in the summer of 1947, targeting Turkic people who had married Han people. As happened before, the different religions and races then began to massacre one another. All of this was ended when the communists entered the area in August 1949. Leaders of the East Turkestan Republic, like Abdul Karim Abbas, boarded a plane to meet Mao. But the plane crashed, leading many people to believe this was a conspiracy by either the Soviets or those more prepared to make a deal with Mao. Saifuddin Azizi travelled by train and agreed to become part of the new communist China, and together they marched on the remaining KMT positions, taking Urumqi in October. Many of the leaders fled, but Osman and his Kazakhs continued to fight until his death in 1951. And so too did Yulbars Khan, one of the leaders of the First East Turkestan Republic, who was defeated in 1950, forcing him to flee to Tibet. Ma Hushan also continued the fight against the communists until 1954, when he was captured and executed. While in the south, more Muslims moved into Burma and launched cross-border attacks. Although not defeated, the Burmese appealed to foreign powers to pressure the Chinese to leave. Some Chinese stayed though, and dominated the drug trade in the area. Southeast Asia therefore continued to be a place for Chinese bandits and dealers to escape to, ever since the Taiping Rebellion and even before. With most of the mainland now under their rule, the People's Republic of China was then established in Beijing, but the KMT still ruled over Hainan Island. This island did have a small communist force even before the Japanese invasion. The Halai people, who were angered with the KMT, supported these communists in the countryside. But the communists didn't have an air force or even a navy to cross over onto the island. This lack of weaponry was proven a couple months earlier, when they tried to take over Kinmen and Dengbu. These are small islands just off the coast of the mainland. Mao's forces were sent to the islands on fishing boats, and there they were met with intensive fire from newly constructed bunkers and many minefields. Regardless, in the spring of 1950, 100,000 communists crossed the straits on fishing boats and junks. Chen Jitang and his KMT forces were not in a great position, as the government was more focused on protecting their base in Taiwan. So the communists were actually able to take Haikou shortly afterwards. Then, once in control, Mao actually worked against the communists on the island, accusing them and their Halai allies of localism. Mao also visited Moscow at this time and signed the Sino-Soviet Friendship Treaty, placing China firmly under the Soviet sphere. This may have seemed an obvious alliance, but it was far from guaranteed. Stalin, for instance, still wanted to claim territories like Port Arthur, and didn't want to antagonize the USA for the sake of Taiwan. Also, encouraging a communist power to rise up in the East could create further rifts within the socialist world, just like how Tito of Yugoslavia had already broken free. But Stalin finally relented, and withdrew claims to Port Arthur. He then sent advisors to oversee modernization efforts, and loaned a great deal of money to the PRC. In return, all surplus material was sent to the USSR to repay the loans, and Mongolia was recognized as an independent country. Now China was allied with the USSR, and in 1950, the Soviets became a nuclear power. Mao then believed the time was right to push North Korea to take over the rest of the peninsula. There is some debate over the exact logic behind it, but Stalin also came on board with the plan, and in 1950, the North Koreans invaded the south. But the United Nations got involved and drove the North Koreans back, so the Chinese discreetly crossed the border and drove the United Nations back down south, thus saving North Korea. General MacArthur then made statements, greatly worrying the PRC, like he wanted to bring the KMT back into power, and there was even talk about using nuclear weapons. So this whole war was portrayed as a defensive war against US aggression. Meanwhile, President Truman said, "The attack upon Korea makes it plain beyond all doubt that communism has passed beyond the use of subversion to conquer independent nations, and will now use armed invasion and war. In these circumstances, the occupation of Formosa by communist forces would be a direct threat to the security of the Pacific area." Formosa, by the way, is the old name for Taiwan. So Truman made promises to defend the Republic of China in Taiwan, and this position would be challenged over the next few years. For instance, in 1950, the small islands of Wanshan and Nangpen were captured, and then in 1953, Dongshang also fell. Plus, while the Korean War was raging, China entered Tibet. The country under the 13th Dalai Lama had failed to modernize, and local disputes kept the country divided. For instance, the Dalai Lama fought the Panchen Lama, and Kham Tibetans had fought against the government in Lhasa. But now, in 1951, Regent Tutob ruled the country, as the 14th Dalai Lama was just a child. The KMT had tried to maintain some sort of presence, or at least claims to Tibet, but really they were left isolated from the world, and had very little contact with other states. Well, back in 1949, not wanting to antagonize the communists, they expelled the KMT delegates, and then tried, far too late, to modernize their army. Mao meanwhile made reclaiming Tibet one of the top priorities of the new government, and sent troops to assemble along the border. Mao argued that this would be a liberation, as he was freeing people from theocratic rule. And there is still a debate raging over what life was like in Tibet prior to the Chinese invasion. This focuses mainly on the prevalence of serfdom. What we can say for sure is that there was of course a great deal of inequality in Tibet given their strict hierarchical society, but the numbers and stories have been greatly exaggerated by the PRC. The Tibetans did agree to meet with the PRC to discuss their territorial integrity, and they hoped to enter some form of agreement, with China controlling Tibet's trade and foreign relations, if Chinese troops stayed out. However, by October 1950, Chinese troops had already crossed the borders, looking to pressure the Lhasa government to sign over their lands. The Tibetans rushed to try and gain foreign support, but this never came. Fighting then began between the two nations, and at the Battle of Chamdo, most of the small Tibetan army was wiped out. The Tibetan government was then forced to sign the 17 Points Plan. As part of this agreement, initially, the Beijing government agreed not to change much in the existing political system of Tibet, but largely Tibet would become part of China. And there were some notable Tibetans who actually supported these actions, like the Panchen Lama, due to his past rivalry with the Dalai Lama. The Lhasa government therefore refused to recognize him as the Panchen Lama, but he got support from the KMT and later the Communists. The KMT actually hoped that the Panchen Lama would join them in a united anti-communist rebellion, but he refused. He was therefore one of the delegates to sign the 17-point plan, seemingly happy to return to Lhasa and challenge the Dalai Lama. However, his ties to the Communists would soon break down, and, for now at least, the Dalai Lama remained in power. Back in China proper though, Mao began making moves to take full control of the country, starting with the land reform campaigns. His huge peasant army were given free rein to confiscate land and, very often, just kill the landlords. It's hard to put a number down on just how many people died during these campaigns, but even Zhou Enlai believed it was over 800,000. The landlords tried to fight back, forming the Homecoming Legion, but their short guerrilla war was unsuccessful. Then, at the end of 1951, the 3 Antis and 5 Antis campaign began. This was supposed to target things like corruption, waste, bureaucracy, bribery, and tax evasion. Thousands of people were sent to spy on businesses and fellow workers in the major cities. Workers were encouraged to send letters reporting mismanagement, and in the first month, 210,000 letters were received. Owners and managers under pressure began making voluntary confessions, even if they were innocent, and they would have to go through struggle sessions hoping to receive forgiveness. But many were sentenced to years in labour camps or were killed. Mao believed tens of thousands of deaths would eliminate the problems in the city, but thousands more killed themselves or were forced to. Apparently suicide was so common in major cities like Shanghai that people avoided walking under tall buildings. The campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries also began in 1950. This targeted a very vague group of people, but Mao had become more convinced of a sweeping, brutal campaign after the beginning of the Korean War. He said, "Wipe out all of the bandits, special agents, local tyrants and other counter-revolutionary elements that bring harm to the people." Again, hundreds of thousands were killed and even more were sent to labour camps. These camps at the beginning could very often be penal farms, where, as you'd expect, many people would be worked to death. It's estimated in these early years that at least 1.3 million people were imprisoned and sent to these farms. So, due to these campaigns in the first couple of years, anywhere between 2 and 5 million people had been killed. Mao had therefore defeated the landlords, business owners, warlords, and most serious opposition in China. This obviously created a sense of fear across the land. For instance, there was a quota for executions, and very often they were public. Plus, unlike in the Soviet Union where the NKVD carried out repression, here this was done somewhat independently by regional leaders, the people, or the militias. Mao did have his cadres, which were just low-ranking civil servants. Early on though, many of these were just old KMT members, but many of these were just killed or dismissed during the campaigns. So high school graduates were called on next, but by the 1960s, even these were seen as disloyal and bourgeois. The old cadres, or those who joined the party before their takeover, were given many high-ranking positions. However, they, while being loyal, lacked the education to carry out many of the necessary jobs. So many of these campaigns were being carried out by a very disorganized system. Other people that were targeted during this time were opium dealers and users. The dealers were just killed, while the addicts, over 10 million of them, were forced into compulsory treatment. This largely drove opium production out of China and into the Golden Triangle region of Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, nearly 1.5 million Chinese were fighting in Korea until 1953. This war, though, ended in a stalemate. Plus, Stalin had died by this point, and the process of de-Stalinization was about to begin in the Soviet Union. Mao had therefore lost his main ally, and he began to feel that his legacy could also be challenged like Stalin's was. Things got even worse for Mao as, over in the United States, Eisenhower was now president. He continued the policy of recognizing the Republic of China and Taiwan, but went even one step further. His administration believed they could unleash Chiang Kai-shek to reinvade the mainland of China. Meanwhile, they were set to sign the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization and a Mutual Defense Pact. So before the treaty was signed, Mao's troops bombarded the islands of Kinmen and Matsu, causing the first Taiwan Straits crisis. These islands, though, were not part of America's defensive agreements, so they didn't get involved, allowing the PRC to attack further islands like Yizang and Dacheng. In response to the crisis, the Formosa Resolution was passed. This granted Eisenhower the right to use whatever force he deemed necessary if the conflict escalated. The option of nuclear war was also debated, as with Stalin dead, they believed the USSR would be reluctant to join in. So it was this threat that persuaded Zhou Enlai to call for a ceasefire. The Americans pressured Chiang Kai-shek to give up the smaller islands, believing they had no strategic value. And peace was made, but only for a bit, as there was another Straits crisis in 1958. This again began when the communists shelled nearby islands. But the Soviet Union stepped in to say they didn't support this action, and the United States provided aid to Taiwan, forcing the PRC to step down. With all of this going on, there was still martial law in Taiwan, and the White Terror had begun. Like in 1949, there was the Penghu incident. During this, school students were conscripted by force, and the principal and some of the students were killed. Or in 1953, Aboriginal leaders, including a musician, were killed allegedly for advocating for autonomy. In the end, over 100,000 people were imprisoned, and 3,000 to 4,000 people were killed, in a period which lasted until the 1980s. So, although the numbers pale in comparison to what was occurring on the mainland, democracy and many freedoms were not given to the people of Taiwan for many years to come. But still the island was out of Mao's reach. So, to finally challenge the Western powers, he began the first 5 years plan. During this, the Soviets helped build factories, but the greatest reforms probably occurred in the countryside though, with the development of workers' collectives. Small groups of families would join together to share resources and tools. At this stage though, their property was still privately owned, however it was now shared. And it was believed that productivity should now grow, as they weren't just subsistence farmers anymore and could now produce enough for export. But joining the collectives were voluntary, meaning many richer peasants were less likely to join. So Mao stepped in 1955, arguing against the richer peasants for not joining in. Local officials across the country heard his words and rushed to meet his new demands, forcing people into these collectives. So by the end of 1956, 90% of the villages of China were part of them. However, Mao continued to watch on as Khrushchev began to de-Stalinize. At the same time, the people of Hungary rose up, forcing the Soviets to send tanks into Budapest. Mao blamed this rebellion on Khrushchev's policy, and eventually their disagreements would lead to the Sino-Soviet split. But at home, Mao was convinced to launch the 100 Flowers campaign, which on the surface seemed like a great liberal idea. He welcomed anybody to voice criticism of his policy, so long as it was constructive and not destructive. Millions of letters were received, but most complained the government had become too bureaucratic and not revolutionary enough. There were of course some who did have genuine complaints, but they were soon rooted out and executed. As Mao declared at the beginning of the new anti-rightist campaign, why is such a torrent of reactionary vicious statements being allowed to appear in the press? To let the people have some idea of these poisonous weeds and noxious fumes, so as to have them uprooted or dispelled. Obviously here he fears that a little bit of liberalism or free press would lead to what happened in Budapest. 300,000 people were then branded as rightists, mainly intellectuals, and were either demoted, executed, or sent to labour camps. During this campaign, Deng Xiaoping targeted so many people that even Mao had to step in, saying, "If we kill too many, we will forfeit public sympathy, and a shortage of labour power will arise." So public discussion and intellectual debate had ended in China. This was sort of a death nail into public discussion and intellectual debate in China, and it wouldn't really re-emerge again, except maybe during the Tiananmen Square protests.
By the mid-1950s, Mao had taken full control of China, and through a series of campaigns, at least a couple million people were killed, the landlords were destroyed, most insurrections had been crushed, and there were no more warlords left in the country. The communists then changed a great deal of the culture in China, like cracking down on the opium trade, making divorce legal, ending child marriage, and formally ending foot binding. Also, the closure of casinos, racing tracks and the likes ended the Shanghai Golden Age once and for all. Mao also centralized all of China onto one time zone, which means many people in China will enjoy daylight hours at completely different times, especially in the Far East or West. But the 5 different time zones the KMT tried to introduce were very rarely followed. Mao also brought back the hukou system. This was an ancient internal passport that was required if you wanted to move about within China. But Mao brought it back because many people were flocking into the cities, and he wanted to make sure enough people remained on the farms to work. Plus, it also allowed him to keep control of the population. 2 internal passports were created, urban and rural. People with an urban passport could receive some degree of social welfare, while the rural people who travelled to a city illegally would find it almost impossible to get a job, receive medical treatment and the likes. However, they still needed to recover from the wars and to modernise. Collective farming had improved agricultural productivity a lot, but still the people lived on rations. This was because a lot of their food and resources were being exported to the Soviet Union at set prices to repay debts, so the country really wasn't making much money. To solve this, they tried to encourage people to save their money in state-owned banks, and they began to encourage a sense of frugality. Then, in November 1957, Mao visited Russia, and was inspired by Khrushchev's goal to surpass America economically. He came up with the slogan, "Exceeding the UK, catching the USA." Or, in real terms, they wanted to produce more steel than Britain in 15 years, and equal to America in 50 years. To start on this process, he launched the Second Five-Year Plan, or more famously known as the Great Leap Forward, in early 1958. Many people in the countryside were then forced into people's communes, where people worked for the state and were fed in communal kitchens, all producing food for the industrial workers. To increase production, villagers were herded into ever larger communes and often forced to sleep in fields. They would have to work near constantly and could, at any point, be sent miles away to work on other projects when needed. Like hundreds of thousands of people were forced into large-scale building projects, like digging irrigation ditches. And in provinces like Gansu, thousands of them died in the process. Meanwhile, millions of people were brought into state industries, putting further strain on those left in the farms. So further rationing was implemented. Plus, the large-scale construction projects left the country with an ever-growing deficit, as still they were producing very little for export. So Mao encouraged the people to set up backyard furnaces to produce their own steel. Scrap metal, people's pots and pans, and any metal objects could be melted down into these makeshift furnaces. However, unskilled workers using basic tools produced unusable steel. And again, this put further strain on the farmers, who were cutting down huge sections of the forest, removed their own doors and furniture from their homes in order to produce the fires needed to produce the steel. In fact, it's estimated around 30% of houses were destroyed to increase field sizes, produce furnaces, or to punish owners. So, to encourage people to work longer and harder, the Communist Party celebrated heroes in labour, like the Soviet Stakhanovite movement. They held up workers like Ni Jifu as a hero after inventing a new drill. Their posters would be plastered around the country, and most would actually enjoy a career in politics afterwards. At the same time, they began to ban many traditions within the communes, like elements of weddings, old festivals and the likes. These were seen as feudal and not part of the new socialist life. Some did try to escape, but they were subject to struggle sessions, were tortured and maybe executed. This could also be the fate for workers who didn't match their production quotas, and it's believed that nearly 10% of the people who died during this period died this way. The peasants were also forced to use some pretty terrible farming techniques. For instance, they used close cropping, which is just when you plant seeds closer together, hoping to produce more. But really, this just made the crops fail. Mao, however, didn't know this, as local leaders just lied and reported record yields. This, however, meant even more food was being sold abroad, leaving the locals with even less.
The problems were made even worse when Mao introduced the Four Pests campaign. This was against mosquitoes because they spread malaria, rodents for spreading the plague, flies and sparrows because they ate seeds. Millions of people organised groups to bang pots and pans to prevent sparrows from resting, and eventually they just died in the air. Others, including many children, would just go around shooting sparrows with slingshots. Sparrows nearly became extinct in China, which allowed the number of locusts to grow. These locusts devastated farms, and the damage was so bad that Mao in 1960 finally realised his mistake. He ordered the campaign to stop, replaced them with bedbugs on the list of pests, and imported sparrows from Russia. With all of these bad ideas, even provinces like Sichuan, which usually produced a great deal of food, began to suffer, because their governor, Li Jingquan, had followed Mao's instructions and executed tens of thousands of skilled workers and intellectuals. So locusts, poor farming techniques, lack of field workers, and unsustainable exports to the USSR all set the stage for the Great Chinese Famine. This truly began in 1959 when a drought and then flooding hit the Yellow River area, but it quickly spread across the country. In total, most seem to say that at least 23 million people died, or 3.5% of the population. Those who suffered lived on coal, tree bark, and sometimes human flesh. But Mao himself allegedly said, "When there is not enough to eat, people will starve to death. It is better to let half of the people die, so that the other half can eat their fill." And to some extent, party elites compared this famine to Stalin's allegedly necessary famine before becoming a great power. Then, to make the situation even worse, it was during this period that they established the Laogai prison system. This was reform through labour, much like the gulags in the Soviet Union, where prisoners would produce products for export. At any given time, it's hard to put a number on how many people were, and still are, enslaved in these camps, but a number that pops up a lot is anywhere between 1 to 2 million. However, from then until now, it has been estimated that 15 million people have died in these prisons, either through starvation, torture, or illness. Mao, though, obviously didn't want to know that his country was starving and reliant on slave labour, so he refused food aid and still continued to ship grain to his allies around the world. Many people around the world actually began to believe that the communists had brought about a great change to China. Well, back in 1955, the Chinese attended the Bandung Conference with other nations from Asia and Africa, and they presented themselves as almost a leader of former colonial nations. Like in 1959, W.E.B. Du Bois said, "China has arisen to her feet and leapt forward. Africa, arise, turn from the West and your slavery." Malcolm X even said of the Bandung Conference, once they excluded the white man, they found that they could get together. This feeling was sort of emulated among the newly independent African nations. Nkrumah of Ghana, for instance, was quick to establish relations with China and even wore a Mao suit on diplomatic missions. Ghana was also one of the first countries that the Chinese loaned money to, hoping to gain some sort of alliance in the continent. Another early ally of sorts was the FLN in Algeria. They were fighting for independence against the French, and China was one of the first countries to recognise them. These two countries also viewed themselves as homelands of revolution on their respective continents, and continued to strengthen ties over the next couple decades. They also formed relations and sent aid to countries like Yemen and Iraq, forming strong relations that would help push the PRC to join the United Nations in later years. Back in China, though, more people were realising the problems with the Great Leap Forward, like Pen Denhui. He was the defence minister, and among the economic issues in the famine, he believed that the new commune militias undermined his army. He shared these criticisms with Khrushchev and then in a private letter to Mao. But at the Lushan Conference of 1959, he was denounced and quickly sacked along with his allies. Many, like Zhou Enlai, stood by Mao, while Lin Biao took Peng's position. Others that rose during this period were the likes of Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. Now, I should say a little bit on how the PRC organised their government. Out of the millions of members that they had, over 2,000 people are selected to become delegates that form the National Congress for 5 years. Only 2/3 of the Congress are party members though, as other seats are reserved for technical experts, some for the many ethnicities of China, and even other political parties, like the China Democratic League and the Revolutionary Committee of the KMT. This Revolutionary Committee, by the way, broke away from Chiang Kai-shek years ago and remained on the mainland. But all of these other political parties have to accept the CCP's authority and largely follow their ideology. Then, out of the National Congress, 380 members form the Central Committee, and out of them, 20 or so people are chosen to become members of the Politburo. Beyond them, there's a standing committee, which is made up of only a few members. The number 2 of the party is the Premier, and below him there's a collection of vice premiers who are all ranked. There's also the party elders, who would hold a lot of power in later years. These higher-ranking members would all meet behind closed doors at plenums to discuss policies. But within this structure, Mao's popularity was on the wane. Even in the countryside, there were the Spirit Soldier rebellions of 1959. These followed a long tradition of rebellions led by secret societies that believed in a salvationist religion, like the Boxer Rebellion or the Nyan Rebellion. And like their predecessors, they still believed that magic could save them from modern weapons. Well, this regiment of spirit soldiers rose up in Sichuan, Shaanxi and Henan. However, they never really managed to encourage many people to join their cause, and they slowly faded out of existence. That same year, though, there was an uprising in Tibet. In fact, there had been other small uprisings among ethnic Tibetans in Kham and Amdo. These were technically under Chinese rule, not Tibetan, and as many were nomadic, they suffered under Mao's land reforms. So in 1956 they rebelled, and in 1958 they formed groups like the Chushi Gan Druk. Even the Americans got involved, and without Lasse's approval, the CIA sent in military support. They also trained some fighters in Nepal before they returned to Tibet to fight. Soon the rebellion spread with the Zhonghua incident, where even Turkic Salar people joined in with the Tibetans to fight against the collectives. Obviously the Chinese launched bloody reprisal campaigns, but the government in Lhasa continued to follow the 17-point plan, which allowed Tibet to have some autonomy, albeit under Chinese rule. However, the communists reported that the Tibetans were on the brink of rebellion, and Mao said this would be a good thing because it will help train our troops and toughen the masses. Furthermore, the chaos will provide a sufficient reason to crush the rebellion and carry out reforms in the future. So Hui Muslim soldiers were deployed to Kham to crush the uprisings there. The Chinese also invited the Dalai Lama to attend a religious dance in their military base. Many believed that this was a ploy to kidnap him, so his officials spread the news to the public, and thousands gathered outside of his palace trying to stop him from attending. This crowd though soon began to attack pro-Chinese Tibetans, including senior lamas that worked with the CCP. They then set up barricades, called for independence, and even brought a petition to the Indian consul seeking their support. Meanwhile, thousands of women continued to surround the palace, and even though the Dalai Lama agreed not to attend, he could now not control the crowds. Seeing the situation worsen, he secretly fled to India, while the Chinese prepared to attack. They shelled the crowds, engaged in house-to-house fighting, and eventually raised their flag in the capital city. Thousands of people were subsequently killed, monasteries looted, and the Panchen Lama, who had a long rivalry with the Dalai Lama, called upon the Tibetans to support the Chinese government. However, his position would soon change. The CIA continued to train thousands of exiles in Nepal and India, but achieved very little. The KMT also met with the exiles and tried to encourage them to join a united front. However, the Tibetans were now more concerned with independence and didn't want to join a KMT China. This invasion of Tibet, however, didn't really help Mao. The failure of the Great Leap Forward forced him to step away from politics. He kept the title the chairman of the Communist Party, but this was largely ceremonial. His other title, the chairman of China, was surrendered to Liu Shaoqi. Liu, along with Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai, worked to stabilize the country and scale back on some of the more radical economic policies. But over the next couple years, hundreds of thousands continued to die though because of the Great Leap Forward. That is until 1962, when the 7,000 Cadres Conference was held. There Liu revealed his findings over the causes of the famine, which he believed were 30% natural disaster and 70% human error.
This further weakened Mao's position, allowing the moderates to make further reforms. For instance, the Sanzi Yi Bao allowed free market trade once again. But that's not to say that China became liberal at all. For instance, in 1962, the Panchen Lama, seeing the treatment of Tibetan people, turned against the communists. He sent a petition to Zhou Enlai requesting aid, freedoms, and even an end to forced abortions. But he was subjected to struggle sessions for this. Then, internationally, China became embroiled in further wars. Like in 1960, they turned to the KMT bases in Burma. U Nu, the president of Burma, had signed a border treaty with Zhou Enlai, and they agreed to jointly expel the KMT there. But the communists struggled in jungle warfare, so most of the KMT soldiers escaped to the Laos-Thailand border, where many began to produce opium in the Golden Triangle. Then there was a far larger war with the Indians in 1962. This war began over a dispute which dates back to British rule in India. They signed a treaty with the Tibetans, setting up their new borders along the McMahon line. But this was never accepted by the Chinese, so they still had claims over Arunachal Pradesh and Aksai Chin. However, the Chinese were making promises to maintain peace in Asia. But when the Tibetans fled to India, they began to believe that the Indians had ambitions on Tibet. Border clashes began right away, like at the Conker Pass, where 9 Indian frontier policemen were killed. So the Indians sought international backing, and most did support them, including the Soviet Union, leading the Chinese to feel a self-defense attack would be necessary. In 1961, they began building bases within Indian land, and then in 1962, while the rest of the world was distracted by the Cuban Missile Crisis, they invaded. The Indians were caught off guard, and within a month of fighting, the Chinese were able to secure control of Aksai Chin. Nearby, the Pakistanis ceded a bit of territory over to China the following year. The Chinese would then try to exploit the Indian-Pakistani War of 1965, issuing an ultimatum to India that they vacate the Nathula Pass. This was rejected, but the Chinese tried to occupy the region, leading to clashes in 1967 which they lost. All of this helped pull Pakistan closer to China, opposing the Soviets and Indians. So the Sino-Soviet split was therefore dividing the world into further camps. However, as the Sino-Soviet relations grew worse, there was the looming threat of nuclear war. The Soviets had aided the Chinese in their quest for nuclear weapons for many years. But around this time, Khrushchev began to fear that the Chinese would use them somewhat indiscriminately. And this was at a time when the Soviets and Americans were looking to stop the nuclear arms race. Khrushchev had also withdrew their experts in 1960, formalizing the Sino-Soviet split for good. China only really found an ally in Enver Hoxha of Albania, who had been denounced by Khrushchev for creating a cult of personality. But for now, that was their only real ally in the communist world. Later, Romania under Ceausescu would almost break free from the Soviet Union, and although neutral, would keep communicating with the Chinese. While in Vietnam, both China and the USSR were sending aid to Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Cong. So to contend with the Soviet Union, the Chinese continued to work on the bomb. They pieced together shredded Soviet documents and sent spies to study aviation in Moscow. The Americans panicked, and Kennedy's administration discussed the possibility of bombing their test site. Ideally, they wanted to do this with the Soviet Union, but obviously nothing came of this. In 1964, Brezhnev removed Khrushchev from power in the Soviet Union, and just a couple of days later, the Chinese finally detonated their first nuclear bomb. Zhou Enlai addressed the public saying, "Have we not exploded an atomic bomb? Has not the label Sick Man of the East, fastened to us by Westerners, been flung off?" The same year they were able to make some strides in their own space program, but they'd need to wait until at least 1970 to launch a satellite, and 2003 until the first astronauts went into space. Elsewhere though, China hadn't really closed the gaps on the Western powers. In fact, during the 60s, they would actually begin to fall behind Japan, Canada and Italy in terms of overall GDP. Mao though continued to stay in the background, leaving the daily running of the country to others. But he did begin to make moves to bolster his cult of personality. For instance, there was a propaganda campaign centered around Li Feng. He was a soldier who was just killed by a falling telephone post.
But in 1963, his alleged diaries were found. These documented his life as a tireless devotee to the revolution and an admirer of Mao. The population was then told to be more like him, and even today he's an iconic figure despite the fabrications. More importantly though, there was the Socialist Worker Education Campaign that same year. This was an incredibly vague and often contradictory series of plans. For instance, Mao wanted to clean up corruption and bureaucracy in the countryside with his 4 cleanups and 5 antis. But this just created a new sense of fear, because officials were supposed to encourage people to work hard, but angry peasants could accuse them of being capitalists, corrupt and the likes. So then Mao turned his attention onto the politicians and urban elites. He began to call them revisionists who turned their back on the revolution. One term he liked to use a lot was capitalist roaders. In general though, these campaigns were unsuccessful, but they set the stage for what would be one of the most notorious periods of China's history, the Cultural Revolution. This all began when Mao revisited a play about a corrupt emperor dismissing a loyal official. It was written years earlier by a subordinate of the mayor of Beijing, Peng Zhen. Mao, however, after revisiting it, believed that this was an attack on him. So Peng became worried that he'd also be held accountable for the play, despite being head of a group loyal to Mao, known as the 5-Man Group. This was a pretty insignificant group that Mao had set up to look into the possibility of a cultural revolution just 1 year earlier. But before Mao even started targeting Peng, he needed to cement his authority within the party. So General Luo Ruqing was accused of placing too much emphasis on military training and not on educating his soldiers on Maoist thought. This, by the way, is still a huge part of the Chinese military, as the Chinese army belongs to the Communist Party, not the country. Think of it as if Biden had a Democratic army in America, where all soldiers were required to study Biden's ideology. Well, in China, new recruits may spend 40% of their time learning about communist ideology and history. So promotion is based on party loyalty rather than talent. Many initially disagreed that Luo was guilty of a crime, but intensive investigations pressured him into attempting suicide, and this, they claimed, was proof of his guilt. Other early victims were the director of the CCP General Office and the propaganda minister. They were all replaced by Mao loyalists, putting Mao firmly in control of internal communications, propaganda, and much of the military. With all of this, he could go after Peng and set up a whole new group, known as the Cultural Revolution Group in 1966. The most notorious members would be called the Gang of Four. This included Yao Wenyuan, Wang Hongwen, Jiang Chunqiao, and Mao's wife Jiang Qin. But there were other notable members, like Kang Shen, who was Mao's head of secret police during the Civil War, and Ji Fuqi, who would become head of public security and could be blamed for a lot of the destruction. With their backing in May 1966, the Politburo met, and there Mao condemned party members who were counter-revolutionary. Although not naming anyone, the May 16th notification created a new sense of fear, saying that there were enemies within the party. While in Beijing, which was still without a mayor, a lecturer at the university created a big character poster criticizing the university administrators for being anti-revolutionary. Mao praised this, prompting a wave of other big character posters being put up across the city. Students began to call out their teachers and take to the streets holding up pictures of Mao. This was still only in June, and the Politburo were caught off guard. They tried to send in cadres to restore order and reopen the schools, but they were now the target of the students' anger. No longer was it just the landlords and businessmen, it was the party officials that were being attacked. Liu Shaoqi demanded that these students and radicals be suppressed, but he could really do very little. Then, in July, Mao, who was now in his 70s, decided to swim across the Yangtze River. This was a huge decision, as after years of taking the sideline, it demonstrated that he was fit and healthy and, almost, ready to reclaim power. Images of the swim were published everywhere, encouraging more people to rise up to support him. Mao even created his own big character poster, calling on his supporters to bombard the headquarters, or, in other words, his political rivals. This gave his followers a cause. But his Red Guards, as they were called, were not a unified force. Rather, after this point, anybody who put on a red armband was in the Red Guard and therefore defending the revolution. Liu by this point could not fight against the Cultural Revolution, so he was sidelined. Lin Biao then became Mao's number 2 in the Politburo, but really the whole Politburo and political infrastructure quickly ceased to exist. Political power was, within the space of a month or two, taken over by the Red Guards. They attacked government offices and denounced local rulers, all the time quoting from Mao's Little Red Book. Hundreds of millions of people had this book, and they could use Mao's quotes to justify almost any action. For instance, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. This was said back in the 1920s, but now it was being brought back. Then Mao called on the loyalists to destroy the 4 olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. While the People's Daily newspaper also called on people to sweep away all cow demons and snake spirits. Essentially everything was set to be destroyed, from literature to temples, setting the stage for Red August. 1 million Red Guards gathered outside Tiananmen Square to meet Mao, and there they were blessed with impunity. For instance, Mao and his wife called on the police and army to turn a blind eye to the growing violence, while Xi Fuqi told the authorities to aid the Red Guard in finding reactionaries. Teachers were some of the first victims, being accused of things like teaching the wrong musical instruments or books, but soon almost anybody could be accused, tortured, killed, or forced into committing suicide. City streets and shops were renamed to things like Defending Mao Zedong Clothes Store, and almost all things that weren't revolutionary were banned. For instance, all foreign and traditional opera was replaced by revolutionary opera, and most sports were wiped out, including things like bodybuilding. In fact, only 2 sports survived this, and that was basketball and table tennis. Then the destruction began. In Beijing alone, nearly 5,000 out of the 6,800 sites that had been designated of historical interest were destroyed. Across the country, around 2.3 million books were burned, as were 3.3 million pieces of art. 77,000 people were forced out of the city, and 200 people were killed every day in these early months. And that's just in Beijing alone, so multiply this number across the whole country. As for notable cases of destruction, the cemetery of Confucius was attacked, and the remains of the Wanli Emperor were dug up, denounced and burned. Shaolin monks were forced to return to secular life, while their temples were looted and also burned. Fortunately for history, the Terracotta Army was not discovered until 1974, and many of the larger historical sites were defended by Zhou Enlai. He sent soldiers to protect sites like the Forbidden City and the Potala Palace in Tibet. But once again, hundreds of thousands of people were killed. They were said to belong to the 5 black categories: landlords, rich farmers, counter-revolutionaries, bad influences, and right-wingers. But as you can see, these labels could really apply to anyone. Any party member that refused to step into line was then persecuted, like Liu, who was sent to a detention camp where he died in 1969, and even Deng Xiaoping was forced out of the city. The former Minister of Defense Peng Dehuai was publicly denounced in a stadium, forced to walk around with chains, and tortured repeatedly for a couple of years. The same thing happened to a couple former vice premiers like Bo Yibo and even Xi Jinping's father. Mao then, in late December, called for an all-round civil war, dividing the country between radicals and the moderates. The Red Guard, however, began to fall into factionalism, fighting one another, trying to prove who was the greatest Maoist. So it's really hard to give any great summary to this period. Sometimes the Red Guard fought one another, sometimes the army joined them, sometimes they tried to fight against them. China had descended very quickly into a state of anarchy. To aid the Red Guard, though, Maoist officials and officers gave them weapons: 18 million guns, 14,000 cannons, 2 million grenades, and in some cities they even got a hold of tanks and armoured vehicles. With these weapons, the radicals were able to take Shanghai in January 1967. There they proclaimed the establishment of a people's commune like the Paris Commune of the 1870s. This only lasted a month before they handed control over to the government, but it encouraged people across the country to try something similar. For example, in late January, in Shihezhi in Xinjiang, the army stopped the Red Guard from taking over, while in Jining,
The Red Guard seized the newspaper offices, but the army used force to reclaim the building. Or in Ganzhou in June, the army handed out weapons to a more conservative mass organization, and then they fought the radical Red Guard on the streets. Wuhan, though, was the scene of some of the biggest clashes. To fight against the Red Guard, General Chen Zaido created his own militia, known as the Million Heroes. He hoped that they would protect the status quo, but as fighting broke out in the streets, Zhou Enlai and Mao travelled to Wuhan in early July. In secret, they pressured Chen to stand down, but the soldiers loyal to him believed that Ji Fuqi and Wang Li had forced him to surrender. So they captured Wang and Ji and beat them up, all the while continuing to fight in the streets. In the end, though, the Red Guard won. Wang and Ji were rescued, and the leaders of the Million Heroes were denounced during show trials. The civil war continued elsewhere, though. One of the bloodiest episodes occurred in Guangxi, where faction fought against faction. Over the whole period, maybe as many as 150,000 people were massacred in brutal ways. Some were buried alive, some were blown up with dynamite or disemboweled. Groups could even rip each other up and engage in cannibalism. Sometimes they'd force teachers to cannibalize fellow dead teachers. Some militia members boasted of eating a number of livers, or even adding genitals into their drinks for health reasons. It seems that the frenzy in Wujian County in particular turned into an orgy of violence almost devoid of politics. There were further massacres in places like Dao County, and in Quanzhou province, families were thrown from cliffs. Then there was also ethnic violence. Like in Inner Mongolia, Kang Shen created a fake independence group and used this to persecute Mongols. 350,000 people were accused of being members and were either killed or tortured in newly built chambers. Then Tibetan monks were attacked, temples like Zhonghan were ransacked, and libraries were burnt. Further campaigns like Cleanse the Class Ranks tried to keep the violence alive, but really it was already on the decline. It's once again hard to put a number on how many people died, but just under 500,000 is often quoted, while over 30 million people were either subjected to struggle sessions or tortured. The violence eventually ended in Tsinghua University, where 2 Red Guard factions threw stones, spears, and even acid at one another. Mao realized it was time for peace and sent factory workers to end the fight, but even they were attacked. So Mao decided to meet with the leaders himself. He said to them, "You have been involved in the Cultural Revolution for 2 years. Struggle, criticism, transformation. Now first, you're not struggling. Second, you're not criticizing. And third, you're not transforming." He then continued to say that most people in the country were unhappy with their actions. The violence therefore subsided, but Mao's policies had once again caused chaos, and much of the agricultural sector was failing once again. So Mao, who had always believed in his revolution coming from the countryside, came up with yet another campaign, Down to the Countryside movement. Hundreds of thousands of young people, including many graduates, were sent to farms to learn from peasants, including a young Xi Jinping. This exodus of young people stopped further violence in the cities, while also spread revolutionary ideas and education to all parts of the country. On top of that, to crush the educated classes, entrance exams to universities were put to an end. In their place, workers from different collectives recommended people to attend university. And I should also say that women did play a major role in both the Red Guards and all sectors of Chinese industry. Back in the 1950s, they created the idea of Iron Girls to promote their involvement in traditionally male industries. Then, by this period, after so much disruption, the majority of farming was carried out by women, and this was seen as a great breakaway from old gender norms. However, the whole concept of feminism was seen as bourgeois. Most rhetoric around women at work was therefore centered around women aiding the state, not necessarily benefiting the individual women. Mao also didn't really seem to care much for the plight of women. As he once said to Kissinger, "What we have in excess is women. Let them go to your place. They will create disasters. That way you can lessen our burdens." But hundreds of thousands of women did go down to the countryside alongside their male counterparts. And it's believed that during this campaign, around 10% of the city's population left the countryside, finally ending the worst stages of the Cultural Revolution. Mao had firmly established himself as the head of the Communist Party with a huge cult of personality. Nowhere is this more obvious than with the mango cult. This began when the Pakistanis sent mangoes to Mao, and he just regifted them to workers near Tsinghua University. Many of the workers had no idea what they were though, so some began to believe that they were peaches of immortality from Chinese mythology. Others preserved them in chemicals, or almost religiously drank the water that they were dipped in. When one man said that they looked like potatoes, he was executed. The People's Daily even wrote a poem beginning, "Seen that golden mango was if seen the great leader Chairman Mao." For those who didn't get a chance to see the mangoes, well, they could buy almost anything with pictures of mangoes on, including bedsheets, ashtrays, and mugs. However, by this point, Mao was very nearly 80 years old, and he needed a successor. In the 1960s, China was in turmoil during the Glorious Revolution, but they still began to look abroad to expand their influence. Early on, Mao had established relations with new countries like Pakistan, Algeria, and Ghana, yet Maoist influence would soon spread across the developing world. In Africa, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania welcomed China, as he saw the Russians as just a new version of white imperialists. The Chinese also began sending aid to countries like Zambia and Sudan. But possibly more important was China's help to revolutionary groups in Africa at that time. For instance, Isaias Afwerki, the current president of Eritrea, was trained in China before returning to fight in the decades-long independence war against the Ethiopians. Those who were trained in China also brought back the party army model, which is the idea that the army should belong to the party and not the country. So rulers like Afwerki would use this to, like the CCP, stay in power for a very long time. Other potential allies were Gaddafi of Libya, who tried unsuccessfully to buy Chinese nuclear weapons in 1970. Yet he was clearly inspired by the Chinese, as he launched his own cultural revolution with his own little green book. Another leader that grew close to China and was inspired by them was Mobutu of Zaire. China, however, had in fact aided the Simba rebellion against him alongside the Soviets in the 1960s. But by this point, Mao was willing to work with anti-communists fighting against Soviet influence. Mobutu even visited China and began wearing Mao suits, called himself citizen, and nationalized a great deal of the industry in Zaire. In later years, China would join Mobutu in supplying aid to Angolan rebels. Again, the Chinese used to work with the Soviets there, helping the MPLA rebels fight against the Portuguese. But now they supported a new rebel group, UNITA, alongside Zaire and the Americans. So even when the Portuguese left Angola, these two groups would continue to fight against each other until 2002. Even in the West, Maoism continued to grow, especially in France after their riots in 1968, or in the USA among groups like the Black Panthers. One member, Elaine Brown, visited China during the Glorious Revolution and reported back, old and young would spontaneously give emotional testimonies, like Baptist converts, to the glories of socialism. Closer to home, Maoism was gaining a sizable following in countries like Cambodia, where Pol Pot copied Mao's peasant-style revolution in his fight against the government. Laos was also going through civil war, but their communists were more inclined to support the Vietnamese, where China had lost all their influence. There were many reasons as to why China had lost all of their influence in northern Vietnam. For one, the Red Guard attacked a Vietnamese consulate, and the Viet Cong refused to follow Mao's instructions on how to conduct the war. So Mao cut off aid to Ho Chi Minh in the late 60s and turned his attention to the Soviet Union, who he almost went to war with in 1969. There were many reasons as to why this war almost broke out, but just to summarize, the Sino-Soviet split had divided the communist world. The Soviet Union feared China's nuclear weapons, Mao was eradicating all moderates, and still viewed the USSR as their main threat, while the Soviets in 1968 lost a lot of support from within the communist world for cracking down on the Prague Spring. Mao then instigated small border clashes, but for an unknown reason. Maybe he wanted to push China to the forefront of the communist world, or he just believed that he could use his huge revolutionary militias. We really don't know. Whatever the reason, they ambushed Soviet troops near Zhenbao Island, then months later along the borders of Xinjiang. Brezhnev, outraged by these actions, was actually debating the use of nuclear weapons. The situation calmed down though when Ho Chi Minh died in 1969. Both communist nations sent ambassadors to the funeral,
and there they agreed to end hostilities. Mao, however, still believed that a war was coming, so he gave further powers to Lin Biao to build up the PLA, while he looked to mending relations with the United States. Back in Southeast Asia though, KMT soldiers were still in Laos, controlling the opium trade after being defeated in Burma. Some ethnic Chinese remained in Burma though, like Kun Sa, who had his own powerful militia in the Shan state. He then crossed into KMT lands and fighting broke out, starting the Opium War of 1967. In the end though, the Laotian government bombed both sides, and then Thai troops helped mop up the KMT drug traders. Further south, communist insurrections continued to spread into Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines and Indonesia, but with no success. Marcos of Philippines, for instance, would declare martial law to fight against them, and in Indonesia, the crackdown led to the deaths of maybe 1 million people. As for Burma, their leaders had always been close to China. For instance, Ne Win initiated the Burmese way to socialism. However, many began to fear that China was spreading their cultural revolution, which led to anti-Chinese riots in 1967. Mao quickly began supporting communist guerrillas, but infighting led to their downfall, and eventually relations would be repaired. Further west in India, there was a communist uprising in Naxalbari. They received support from the Chinese, and their leader, Chara Mazumdar, even wrote, "China enabled the revolutionaries all over India to unite. China's chairman is our chairman, and China's path is our path." So their insurgency continued, spreading down what has been called the Red Corridor, and it actually still rages today, even encouraging further rebellions in Nepal. In that country, the Maoists, after a long civil war, would be given a place in the government. There were also other Maoist groups nearby, like in Sri Lanka, but Mao continued to support the ruling government there and maintained close relations, so the rebels received no support. But going back to China, just across the border lay British Hong Kong and Portuguese Macau. They had been swamped with refugees ever since the communist takeover. In Hong Kong, for instance, their population grew from 750,000 in 1945 to over 3 million in 1961. Tensions grew worse inside the country and resulted in the 1956 riots, which saw KMT supporters and communists clash on the streets and even attack foreigners. Then in 1967, communist sympathizers and trade unions went on strike. Clashes soon erupted, and then the riot police were called in. Some high-ranking generals, like Huang Yongsheng, hoped to exploit the situation and invade. Communist Red Guards were sent to attack the border police, hoping to cause a response. But the well-trained Gurkhas on the Hong Kong border that July did not return fire. But the riots continued, and the communists even placed bombs throughout the city. So the British declared martial law and launched raids on their headquarters. In the end though, Zhou Enlai, who was already worried about the spread of violence in China, ordered the protesters in Hong Kong to stop. In the wake of these riots, the British decided a change of policy was in order. Beforehand, Governor Cowperthwaite favoured laissez-faire capitalism, and this did allow Hong Kong's economy to grow. But thousands were left impoverished and unrest was growing. So when Murray McLehose came to power, he reversed all of this. They built the mass transit system, introduced subsidised housing, compulsory education and the likes. And people were given a say, albeit small, in elections for members of the Urban Council. Yet the Hong Kong riots of '67 were probably inspired by events in nearby Macau. This small colony had just introduced the Grand Prix and casinos in the 60s, finally allowing it to grow. But the Portuguese segregated their school children along ethnic lines. In December 1966, when the authorities stopped the construction of a new school, riots erupted. The Portuguese were able to restore order, but in the grand scale of things, this was a great defeat. Chinese soldiers were sent to prevent the Red Guard from attacking the colony, and Salazar of Portugal knew this. So his governor sent an apology to Mao and agreed to defend the ethnically Chinese businessmen. This group made a great deal of money and quickly began to take over the day-to-day running of the colony. Across the straits, Chiang Kai-shek was watching all of this unfold. And he had already been dealt a huge propaganda blow when his old comrade and enemy Li Zhongren visited communist China. Many other warlords like Yan Jishan and Bai Chongxi had already died, while those who remained in Taiwan like Shen Shikai from Xinjiang were barely popular. Or there was Ma Bufang, who was still alive,
but he had moved to Saudi Arabia. These were pretty much the remnants of the old warlords. So Li's visit to the mainland was a huge blow to Chiang, but the lack of prominent leaders did allow him to continue to rule as an authoritarian, maintain martial law, and continue to arrest communists during his White Terror. Yet he still saw himself as the rightful ruler of United China, and to reclaim it, he set up Project National Glory in 1961. This was a plan to invade Xiamen in a surprise attack, and then just hope millions of people would rise up in his support. Plus, it should be said that Chiang still held claims to Tuva and Mongolia. For instance, in the 1950s, he prevented Mongolia from joining the United Nations. And he also claimed the small islands in the South China Sea, which the Communist Party still controversially lay claim to today. The claims to these islands date back to the end of World War II, when the KMT were looking to expand their influence in the vacuum that the Japanese left behind. So they sent ships to the islands when the Japanese surrendered, but before this, the islands were barely inhabited. The first bases on the Parcel Islands, for instance, were French when they ruled Vietnam, while the Spratly Islands were claimed by both the Vietnamese and the Chinese in the 1800s. But fishermen from various countries used them, and then weirdly, it was claimed by one of the world's first micronations, the Republic of Morak Songrati Medes. This was set up in the late 1800s, and the family continued to petition leaders, including Chiang Kai-shek, to recognize their independence. The original KMT claims to these islands, though, were shown by an 11-dash line, while the communists changed it to 9 dashes after making a deal with the Vietnamese. Now, however, the islands, or at least parts of them, are claimed by nearly every country in the region. So Chiang had some bold plans, and in 1965 he sent troops to Jinmen Island, prepping for an invasion. But their ships were intercepted, men died on exercise, and the plans were put on hold. He knew that he needed American assistance, and to entice them, he made promises to join in the Vietnam War. However, his plan was to invade Guangdong Province, the old homeland of the KMT, hoping to cut off supplies to the Viet Cong. The Americans still refused, though, but Chiang still hoped to exploit the turmoil caused by the Cultural Revolution. Many of his advisors, though, believed that only if they could create a powerful economy that they could potentially hope for a Hungarian-style revolution on the mainland and have the capacity of supporting an invasion. Li Kuo-ting was instrumental in guiding Taiwan from an agrarian society to a world leader in technology, allowing their GDP to grow 10% every year. To show their growth as a comparison, in 1950, their GDP per capita was $1,500. The Democratic Republic of Congo had $1,000 per person, and Bolivia's was over $3,000. Well, by 1970, Congo was only $1,200, Bolivia was $3,400, but Taiwan was over $4,000. By 1990, they were at $16,000, while Congo was below $1,000 and Bolivia was still at $3,400. To do this, major businesses and banks were nationalized. Gold reserves and American aid prevented them from suffering from hyperinflation again, and land was redistributed to alleviate poverty. Plus, new businesses were being established by mainland refugees, and strong ties to Japan, Thailand, Philippines, and South Korea also helped with trade and investment from abroad. With all of this new wealth, they made welfare reforms, and their economy grew so much that American aid was stopped. They also would later embark on the 10 major construction projects, including new railway lines, highways, ports, nuclear power plants, and more. However, as they imported nuclear reactors from countries like Canada and uranium from South Africa, they would also begin to secretly work on a nuclear weapons program. This, however, would later be discovered and abandoned. Yet, despite their new wealth, no rebellion on the mainland came. And in 1969, Chiang Kai-shek was involved in a road accident, forcing him to step back from politics and the plan to be shelved. Yet, by this point, the chaos of the Cultural Revolution had ended, and Mao had cemented his control over the party and population. But Mao, by now, was in his 80s, and he needed a successor. At the 9th National Congress, he selected Lin Biao, but Lin now had to struggle for power against the Cultural Revolution group. Madame Mao, for instance, didn't like him, and she was formidable in the government. For instance, she also didn't like Zhou Enlai, so she had his children murdered by the Red Guards and continued to make sure Zhou could not achieve any great power. But now she had to deal with Lin's growing power. As the head of the military, he had a lot of support from many of the officers, and then he was joined by Chen Boda, the chairman of the Cultural Revolution Group. This made his faction even more powerful than Zhou Enlai's and Madame Mao's. But this new power also made Mao immediately suspicious. So he denied Lin's advice to take the title of president, a title which had been out of use since the fall of Liu Shaoqi, believing this was Lin's attempt to grab power. Chen Boda was then purged, and then Mao decided to rehabilitate civilians and party members that Lin had persecuted. This now portrayed Lin as the most violent member of the Politburo. Then, to completely undermine Lin's politics, Mao even looked to repair relations with the United States. Then, Lin made the mistake of criticizing Mao's wife at the next conference. After this, Mao made his move. The officers loyal to Lin were forced to do self-criticism, and then Lin died in a plane crash in September 1971. But what happened is a mystery. The official story claims that Lin had attempted to assassinate Mao and then defect to the Soviet Union, but his plane ran out of fuel and crashed in Mongolia. This alleged coup attempt was called Project 571. However, nobody really knows exactly what happened. Some sources say that the coup was real and the Soviets were involved, and they killed him in China when it failed. Others say he was killed in the plane crash, but it was travelling away from the USSR, not towards it. And some speculate he was on his way to Taiwan, but accidentally crashed. Whatever the case may be, all those loyal to Lin were purged. But his death did mark a great shift among the population. Many began to see that the government was not always constantly correct, so the cult of personality began to disappear. Madame Mao tried to restore the prestige of her husband by launching the Criticize Lin, Criticize Confucius campaign, which also attacked Zhou Enlai. But Mao suffered from a stroke in late 1971, and he still had no successor. So he rehabilitated many of his former comrades, while Zhou Enlai became his number 2. Plus, with Lin now gone, Mao and Zhou Enlai finally accepted Kissinger's invitation to meet with Nixon. The two had actually established links with one another via ping-pong diplomacy, as an American team was invited to play in the capital. This Sino-American agreement would help both nations bring an end to the Vietnam War and push back their mutual enemy, the Soviet Union. Plus, by now, the global situation had completely changed thanks to Albania. They approached the United Nations demanding that the PRC be recognized as the official China. In their words, the reality should not be changed to suit the myth of a so-called Republic of China, fabricated out of a portion of Chinese territory. So, the United Nations had a vote on which China should be recognized. The communist world, most of Europe, including the UK and France, Iran, India, half of Africa, and many more voted on behalf of the communist. Now Mao's PRC was the officially recognized China, taking their place alongside America, France, Britain, and the USSR on the Permanent Council. The following year, Nixon visited Beijing to meet Mao, who joked, "I believe our old friend Chiang Kai-shek would not approve of this." The whole trip was televised and proved to be the deciding factor in many countries recognizing Mao's government as legitimate, rather than Chiang Kai-shek's, including even Franco of Spain. Then, after the deals were made, panda diplomacy helped increase China's soft power around the world. This is when the Chinese just loaned pandas to foreign zoos, where they would usually be met by some high-ranking official, or, in the United States case, by Pat Nixon. Japan also normalized relations with the communists around this time. Prime Minister Tanaka acknowledged damage his nation had caused to China, and in return, the Chinese dropped their demands for reparations. However, as China moved to formalize relations with the West, they lost their oldest ally, Albania. They had helped get the CCP into the United Nations, but now they were angry with Mao for signing a deal with, in their words, a frenzied anti-communist. Obviously, though, their relations with the United States were now far more important. But it led to the complicated one China policy of the United States and many countries. In the words of the Americans, the United States acknowledges that Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of China. The United States does not challenge that position. In later years, though, the Taiwan's Relations Act and Reagan's 6 assurances promised to trade with and protect Taiwan. Japan and other nations had equally ambiguous policies, one which recognized there's only one China, but deals with two. This, by the way, has a name, strategic ambiguity, and it has the benefit of deliberately not revealing any potential responses to any potential action. Yet, as part of their repaired relations with China, the Americans did agree to stop funding Tibetan rebels, ending much of their hopes for independence. But there was foreign involvement in other uprisings, as the Soviets turned to funding the rebels in Xinjiang. Independence groups like the United Revolutionary Front of East Turkestan was already based in Kazakhstan and received a great deal of support. The Chinese responded to this by forcing Han people to live in the region, increasing their numbers from 7% of the population to over 40%. Many of these were settled on the border, creating a buffer zone between the Uyghurs and their fellow Turkic people across the border in Kazakhstan. This is how the situation would remain until the mid-70s. But then everything would change in 1975 and 76, as Chiang Kai-shek, Zhou Enlai, and finally Mao Zedong would all die. In Taiwan, Chiang was eventually succeeded by his son, Chiang Ching-kuo, who continued many of the economic policies of his father. In fact, it was him that launched the 10 major construction projects. He also began to move Taiwan towards more liberal ideas, like relaxing laws on freedom of speech. While on the mainland, thousands of people mourned the death of Zhou Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping gave a eulogy at his funeral, placing him firmly on the side of the moderates. Deng had already been purged during the Cultural Revolution, and only made his way back into politics recently thanks to Zhou Enlai. He then quickly climbed up the party ladder and found himself as Mao's number 2. The Gang of Four obviously didn't like this. They had already stopped many people from publicly mourning Zhou Enlai's death, but they believed that many people would use the Qingming festival as an excuse to mourn him, as this festival is traditionally when people pay homage to ancestors. The gang published articles attacking both Zhou and Deng, but mourners still gathered in Nanking and in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. When the police removed wreaths and memorials to Zhou, the people rioted, starting the Tiananmen incident of 1976. Police dispatched the crowds while Deng Xiaoping was blamed for orchestrating the entire thing. So Hua Guofeng was named the new successor to Mao. He had been the governor of Hunan and later Minister of Public Security, but really he had very little power. Yet with Mao's health failing, he did begin to plot against the Gang of Four, believing they would do the same to him if he didn't act first. Luckily for him, many others also hated the gang, like the defense minister, the head of the elite 8341 Corps, the head of the military in Beijing, and Li Jianin, the vice premier. Then Mao himself died in September 1976, and this new faction made their move. They invited members of the gang to a meeting and arrested them, while Mao's widow was arrested in her home. They were brought to trial in 1980 and imprisoned, where Madame Mao killed herself. Hua Guofeng and his new allies were now in charge of the country, and he ordered that he be called the Wise Leader, and ordered that his photo should be placed next to Mao's in public. Internationally, he visited Europe, meeting leaders like Thatcher. But domestically, his constitution continued to call for continuous revolution, and he almost brought China backwards by looking to instigate a new Soviet-inspired 5 or even 10-year plan. He made himself even more unpopular by issuing the 2 whatevers, promising to uphold whatever decision Mao made and instruction he had. This went completely against the growing number of people who were advocating for market reforms, led by the recently rehabilitated Deng Xiaoping. So Deng led his allies to peacefully usurp power from Hua in 1978, at a meeting of the Central Committee. At this meeting, the leaders agreed to pretty much follow Deng Xiaoping's vision of China, like the 4 modernizations, which should, in theory, turn China into a powerful socialist nation by the end of the century. Denounced people were rehabilitated, whether or not they were dead or alive, like Peng Dehui and Bo Yi-do. Hua's image was removed from schools, ending the cult of personality. There was also the Democracy Wall in Beijing, where people posted big character posters, initially criticizing the Gang of Four, and eventually calling for all sorts of reforms. Many scientists were brought back to work, university exams were re-established, and he called on the people to seek truth for themselves, rather than relying on the word of one man. In this far more liberal climate, people began printing and distributing their own newspapers, albeit very small. and many demanded more, including a fifth modernization. As well as agriculture, industry, defense, and science, which Deng Xiaoping advocated for, they also wanted democracy. More importantly, though, the party agreed to end the continuous class struggles in favor of economic reform. All of this was part of Boluan Fangzhen, or eliminating chaos and returning to normal. Deng was able to introduce all of these reforms despite not really having power. However, they proved so popular that in 1981 he was officially made leader. But once becoming leader, not everything was so great for the people. Deng later launched the Strike Hard anti-crime campaign in 1983, when tens of thousands were sentenced to death to quell growing crime and political dissent. And possibly the most problematic change was the one-child policy. Previously, Mao had gave out mixed messages on having children. For instance, in the 1960s, when the United Nations held a conference on population control, the Chinese called it an imperialist tactic to keep the third world countries down. But sometimes he encouraged women in China to have fewer children or space them out so they could work more. To this end, barefoot doctors, who were usually just high school graduates, were sent out into the countryside. They helped with all sorts of basic treatments, but also aided in abortions. They would sometimes use traditional medicines like blister beetles, or, more often than not, an overdose of malaria medicine. But the population seems to have doubled during Mao's rule, from 500 million to 900 million in 1976. So many people began to turn to the works of the economist Ma Ying-chu, who long called for population control. However, as it was usually ideological economists like Chen Yun who supported the plan, some speculate that the population crisis was fabricated. So maybe the real reason behind the policy was to limit the population and thus make it easier to achieve their modernizing goals. Plus, generations of wealth would be consolidated rather than spread out between many children, thus eliminating a lot of poverty. So, in 1980, the policy was put into place. Contraception was made readily available, especially IUDs, which were given to 300 million women. On top of that, 100 million people were sterilized, sometimes in exchange for cash payments. But those who went on to have a second child were made to either have an abortion or pay huge fines. These fines, called the social child raising fee, could be huge in cities, the equivalent of a couple years' salary. So generally, richer people could afford to have 2 children. If any child was born illegally, they'd have no internal passport, and therefore they couldn't get a job or receive an education. Plus, their parents could lose their job as well. There were some exemptions given though. For instance, if their first child was disabled, or if they lived in the countryside, where the rules were a little more relaxed. Because of these policies, the fertility rate quickly fell, from 2.8 to 1.5. However, it's also caused huge social issues. For starters, Chinese parents had long preferred to have sons over daughters, and they even used to drown their daughters in a practice known as Ni Nu. This was back in the 19th century, when missionaries reported that in some provinces, 1/3 of baby girls were killed. There are many reasons behind this. For instance, Confucianism did lay the responsibility of helping parents in their old age at the feet of men, so daughters were seen as more of a burden. In 1980, the communist government even acknowledged that these beliefs still exist, especially as the rates of female abandonment and infanticide spiked. So it's believed that 22% of pregnancies ended in abortion, especially if they knew that they were going to have a girl. This has left China with far too many men compared to women. Plus, on top of that, China now has an aging and declining population in the 21st century. But going back to Deng's more liberal reforms, in a way they could be compared to Gorbachev's perestroika. However, Deng limited the extent of change by creating special economic zones. These were in cities like Shenzhen, which was only a small town but quickly became one of the richest cities and home to companies like Huawei. Now China was opened up, they went from being the world's 32nd largest exporter to the 13th by 1990. But still their GDP lagged behind countries like Japan, Brazil, Italy and Canada. Meanwhile, with Britain's lease on Hong Kong running out, he met with Margaret Thatcher, and she agreed to hand it back to China in 1997. China did promise to respect Hong Kong laws for the following 50 years, but this isn't exactly happening. The Portuguese then followed suit a couple years later and agreed to give them Macau in 1999. Further afield, Pol Pot took power in Cambodia and remained one of China's staunchest allies, even as he killed millions of his own population. But in 1978, the Vietnamese invaded the country. Deng Xiaoping, who was moderate, did blame Pol Pot for being too radical, but he was still obliged to attack northern Vietnam to aid the Khmer Rouge. Deng even threatened war with the USSR if they got involved, but the Sino-Vietnamese War was short. China declared victory after capturing a little bit of land and returned home, while Vietnam continued to invade Cambodia and occupy the country for 10 years. 1979 was also when the Rhodesian Bush War ended. During this war, the Soviets supported Joshua Nkomo in their fight against the white minority, while China supported Mugabe. The Chinese even helped train his Zanla party in guerrilla tactics, helping Mugabe eventually emerge victorious. China did though lose an ally in Somalia. They went to war with communist Ethiopia, which was an ally with the USSR. The Ethiopians won this war, the Ogaden War, leaving Somalia in a state of chaos and unrest for decades. However, the Eritreans were on the verge of gaining their independence from Ethiopia, giving the Chinese another ally in the region. More importantly though, in the late 70s, the Soviets moved into Afghanistan. The Chinese were already angered by the Soviets for many reasons, including their funding of East Turkestan independence groups. So the Chinese, alongside the Americans, sent money and weapons to the Mujahideen throughout the 80s. The Soviets would only pull out of the country once Gorbachev came to power in the mid-80s, and he tried to repair relations with China. To do this, he conceded quite a lot, like withdrawing troops from Mongolia, and then he even agreed to visit Beijing in 1989. But the Chinese were also repairing relations elsewhere. Like in 1983, they normalized relations with South Korea, but for a very weird reason. That year, Chinese passengers hijacked a plane and demanded that the pilot fly them to Taiwan. The pilot, however, tried to land in North Korea, but the hijackers forced him to South Korea, which was in a state of turmoil. Inside that country, there were democracy movements, coups, and martial law. But because of the hijacking, China and South Korea set up diplomatic channels and normalized relations, greatly angering the North. In fact, China by this point was largely turning its back on the North in favor of their deals with richer capitalist nations. Deng had therefore opened up China to the world and set them on their path to their economic miracle. However, he would soon have to deal with a great deal of unrest.
In the 1970s, Deng Xiaoping had taken over China and launched a series of economic reforms, turning the country into one of the richest in the world. However, people inside the country were growing angry, especially in universities. Like in 1988, African students who had been invited to study in China were attacked because they were with Chinese women. This led to riots in Nanjing, as many called for Africans to be deported. Or 2 years earlier, a professor named Fang Lizi spoke in favor of more rights. He was forced to attend a conference where he was criticized. The students at the University of Science and Technology in Hefei protested this, and soon the protest spread to many other cities. Like in Shanghai, there they were met by a pretty unknown official at the time, Jiang Zemin. He spoke to the students, reciting the Gettysburg Address, and despite making no promises, this meeting largely ended the protest. Yet elsewhere the protests continued, as many people were angry by many things at this point. For instance, the family of corrupt party elites and their friends were enjoying the benefits of an open economy, while the poor suffered. And this was made even worse by the fact that inflation was at 28%. Plus, Deng Xiaoping's reforms had made it possible for people to openly vent about some issues in spaces like universities. So this was sort of mirroring what was happening in the USSR, as more people were talking more openly about more problems. The students also got even more support from Hu Yaobang. He had supported Deng Xiaoping's reforms throughout and rose to become General Secretary of the party. However, he made a lot of enemies. For instance, the PLA didn't like him because he tried to reduce the defense budget. And then he launched an investigation to look at corruption and nepotism among the party crown princes, or the princelings. These were the children of old party members that still held a great deal of power. So, when Hu didn't outright condemn the protests, his enemies turned on him and he was forced to resign. Other members who didn't openly criticize Hu Yaobang were also punished, like Hu Jintao, who was sent to Tibet. There, after some small protests, he declared martial law and brought the army in. However, what exactly happened during those days is up for debate, but the crackdown was brutal enough
that the party elders welcomed Hu Jintao back to Beijing, and his actions could have been an inspiration for what was to come. Largely by this point, Deng Xiaoping believed that his liberalization programs had gone too far, and hardliners were filling up his government. Then, in 1989, Hu Yaobang died, and like with Zhou Enlai beforehand, his death brought crowds to Tiananmen Square. The mourners soon began to call for more reforms, and on the day of Hu's state funeral in late April, 100,000 people descended onto the square, and these students chose their own leaders, including Wang Dan. Students also gathered in cities like Xi'an and Changsha, leaving the government completely divided. General Secretary Zhao Ziyang encouraged dialogue, while Premier Li Peng didn't want to make any more concessions. So the students remained in the square for weeks, some even beginning to go on hunger strike. It was then around this time that Gorbachev visited Beijing. This gave some hope to the protesters, as they believed the government would want to avoid embarrassment at all costs. Yet, the government just held the welcoming ceremony at the airport in mid-May instead. But the crowd still grew, to maybe 1 million people, as many local workers joined to support the students on hunger strike. On the 19th, Zhao Ziyang went to Tiananmen Square and gave a famous speech, saying, "Students, we came too late. We are sorry. You talk about us, criticize us. It is all necessary. Unlike you, we are already old and do not matter." During this speech, he also called on the students to end their hunger strike, but only to protect themselves. So many people celebrated this speech, he had already been purged from the party. Li Peng had convinced Deng Xiaoping to declare martial law in Beijing, while in Shanghai, Jiang Zemin declared his support for martial law. But at the same time, he was meeting with protesters in his city and promised them further dialogue and concessions. So he became an ally of both the reformers and the hardliners. In Beijing, though, the army was sent in. The protesters were initially able to stop them from moving towards the square. Li Peng began to refer to them as American-sponsored terrorists, and Deng Xiaoping later revealed to Pierre Trudeau that he was worried that the CCP could have collapsed, as any faction could have used an army unit to begin another civil war. Tanks were then sent into the capital, firing at the crowds, and even running over some. Early in the morning on the 4th of June, the soldiers arrived at the square. Many students and protesters still refused to vacate though, so the soldiers fired again into the crowds. This continued throughout the day, and it's hard to know just how many people were killed, but it could be as high as 10,000. The next day, the army was in full control of the city, and they paraded tanks through the centre. That's when one unidentified man stepped out in front of them. Many reports say that he was not the only person to do this though, just the only person to be recorded on camera. Some of those who survived were able to escape to Hong Kong through the internationally funded Operation Yellowbird, and they left behind a very divided country and government. To bridge the gaps, Jiang Zemin was promoted to General Secretary, as he was seen as a compromise candidate, not a supporter of the protesters or the now unpopular Li Peng. At first though, he had very few allies, and therefore little power. So he began bringing people from Shanghai into the central government. Then just 1 year later, Deng Xiaoping resigned, at least officially, but his faction still held real power. However, both Jiang Zemin and Deng Xiaoping watched on as people from Eastern Europe rose up and the Soviet Union collapse. In the wake of this, hardliners in China began to blame liberalization for the fall of the USSR, and they also said that Deng's reforms were the cause of the Tiananmen Square massacre. But Deng Xiaoping and moderates believed the problem was the lack of opportunities in these countries, and therefore further market reforms were needed. So like the Kangxi Emperor centuries earlier, he made a tour of the south in 1992. He visited cities that benefited from his reforms like Shenzhen, and he garnered a great deal of support. Jiang Zemin decided to support him in this, promising to continue down the same path, putting himself firmly on the side of more economic reforms. Jiang Zemin, however, also increased military spending, gaining allies from within the PLA, and then he appealed to many hardliners by challenging Taiwan during their first multi-party elections in 1996. The Taiwanese president, Chiang Ching-kuo, had tried to stop the democracy movement for a long time. Like in 1979, pro-democracy leaders were arrested during the Kaohsiung incident, but this received a lot of condemnation from both home and abroad. Calls then grew louder during the 80s, and then the Liaoyu massacre ended martial law for good. This began when Vietnamese refugees had landed on the small island and were fired at, and some, including mothers and children, were executed. The soldiers here were in fact guarding Taiwan's secret nuclear weapons program, which was allegedly 2 years away from turning them into a nuclear power. But now the secret was out, and the Americans forced Taiwan to abandon their plans. So, with martial law over, new parties like the Democratic Progressive Party was formed. This was followed by the huge Wild Lily student movement of 1990, when 300,000 students demanded change, almost like the Tiananmen Square incident. But Lee Teng-hui, the new president, chose to respond by promising the people full democracy rather than massacring them. In 1995, Lee then visited America, greatly angering Jiang Zemin, who mobilized his men and fired live missiles into the straits. He then warned the people of Taiwan that if Lee was re-elected, it would mean war. The Americans then sent ships into the straits, and the people of Taiwan still elected Lee regardless. These sorts of empty threats, by the way, were openly mocked in the Soviet Union, where they used the expression China's final warning, which means any warning which carries no real consequence. Yet Jiang's actions had gained him supporters across the party by the time that Deng Xiaoping died in 1997. Jiang now had complete power, and he oversaw the final takeover of Hong Kong and later Macau, greatly increasing his prestige. Elsewhere, the conflict in Xinjiang began to ramp up once again, with further repressions and terrorist attacks, like the 1997 Urumqi bus bombings. So when the United States invaded Afghanistan and began their war on terror, they did receive a great deal of support from China, as this provided an excuse to target Uyghurs within their own borders. Meanwhile, over in Tibet, the Panchen Lama had died, and the new Panchen Lama was selected, who was just a 6-year-old boy. But the Chinese government was unwilling to see this happen, so they had the boy kidnapped and appointed their own government-approved Lama. However, the location of this boy still remains a mystery. Jiang Zemin also brutally began to crack down on Falun Gong practitioners. This was just a new type of Qi Gong, similar to Tai Chi in a way, and it emerged in the 1990s. Initially, it was in fact welcomed by the CCP. Over time, around 90 million people began to practice it. This, along with their religious attitudes, prompted Jiang Zemin to launch a crackdown on them. The 610 office was created to harass, beat, torture, and kill many of the practitioners and their families, and in thousands of cases, even harvest their organs to sell. Around this time, there were also moves to censor the early internet. Wang Bingjing worked on the Golden Shield, and this would eventually pave the way to the Great Firewall of China, which banned most websites and even keywords. So Jiang Zemin was ruthless in some regards. He continued with economic reforms. He completely opened up the country and joined the WTO in 2001. Whole sectors of industry were privatized, and this is when Apple and other major companies entered China, setting the stage for their economic miracle. However, to fuel this, millions were forced to work for very little money. For instance, some 4 million people in garment factories earned just 13 cents a day. Then whole cities were turned into production lines, like Yiwu, where most of the world's Christmas decorations come from, and it's also a major counterfeiting hotspot. Even those who didn't work in industry suffered, as cities were covered in a haze of pollution, acid rain caused huge environmental and human damage, and hundreds of thousands died prematurely. China still continued to advance. Zhu Rongji was actually the man behind many of these reforms, and not all of them were popular. For instance, he closed down many state-owned operations that were losing money, and this left millions unemployed. But he also targeted corruption and poor business practices. He centralized taxation and set price controls on basic products to appease the poor and curb inflation, making him one of the greatest economic reformers of the period. So by the early 2000s, China's GDP had overtaken the likes of Italy, and within just a few years, it would be far richer than every European nation. Jiang, around this time, came up with his 3 represents as the country's new guiding philosophy. 1. Represent the development trend of China's advanced production forces. 2. Represent the orientation of China's advanced culture. And 3. Represent the fundamental interests of the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people. So, China had completely opened up and largely became capitalist. And while many countries did begin dealing more and more with this new capitalist China, the Indians still distrusted them. And in 1998, the Indians developed their own nuclear weapons, and Defense Minister George Fernandez declared China is enemy number one. So China continued to lend their support to Pakistan in wars like the Kargil War of 1999. But then China was going to suffer a great humiliation. The Karmapa, the head of the Karma Kagyu school of Buddhism in Tibet, fled to India, specifically to Sikkim. This territory had only just been formally annexed by India in the 1970s, and this greatly angered the Chinese. But because the Karmapa had fled there, this meant the Chinese couldn't demand the Indians repatriate him, because that would mean they formally recognise the annexation of Sikkim. Plus, this was a further humiliation, as the Chinese had endorsed this religious leader. So, in the end, in 2003, the Chinese had to finally relent and recognise Indian rule in the area. Plus, relations with North Korea continued to sour. As the Soviet Union collapsed, the Kim family lost their number one source of income. China also stopped selling discounted food to the country and providing interest-free loans. This lack of aid caused a famine in the mid-1990s and killed possibly a couple million people. The Chinese did begin to fear a refugee crisis though, so they offered some aid. But they would later condemn North Korea's nuclear tests and impose sanctions on the country. So tensions between these two haven't exactly been repaired. Internationally though, Jiang Zemin's most ambitious diplomatic move was the development of the Shanghai Five in 1996. China, along with Yeltsin of Russia and Central Asian nations, signed an agreement to create in their world a multipolar world. Or, in other words, they wanted to challenge the dominance of the Americans in the post-Cold War world. The countries in this agreement would grow to include Pakistan, India and Uzbekistan, while half of the Asian continent are observers or prospective members. The renamed Shanghai Cooperation Organization hasn't quite reached the lofty ambitions of the leaders though, as it's not really a defensive alliance like NATO, or it hasn't become an EU-style trading bloc like Wen Jiabo wanted. But by this time though, Jiang Zemin had agreed to step down as president, serving his full terms in office. Hu Jintao took over after him, but Jiang largely remained in power behind the scenes, and even kept titles, like the chairman of the Central Military Commission until 2004, who, by the way, after gaining prominence in Tibet, had been chosen to join the Politburo and was seen as a good candidate to represent the new generation of leaders. He began working to promote Jiang's reforms in philosophy and came to international attention when he voiced anger at NATO for bombing the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, which the United States said was a mistake. Well, he was made the official leader of China in 2002, and he made Wen Jiabo premier. Right at the beginning of his term, China's space program achieved a major success, as they launched their first manned mission. They had been working on this for decades. Like in the 1970s, they launched a satellite into space, but they were just one of the few countries to persevere with it, and became the third country in the world to independently put men into space. Otherwise, Hu and Wen tried to restore some degree of equality within China with their harmonious socialist society concept. However, in the background, Jiang's Shanghai clique prevented any major reforms from taking place. Hu also lost his own prodigy, Meng Shuai-nong, because of the SARS outbreak in 2003. He, like many others, were blamed for their slow response, while China as a whole was blamed for covering up the outbreak. And just as a side note, it was after this virus that the Wuhan lab began to study coronaviruses. Yet, under Hu, China's economy grew at around 10% a year, and he was able to introduce welfare programs like providing nationwide healthcare for people on the cheap. Internationally, he formed BRICS, with Russia, Brazil, India, and later South Africa. These emerging economies meet every year to discuss trade policies and the likes, and again, they were supposed to begin to challenge the G7. However, these countries have wildly different political and economic systems. There are still border issues between India and China, and a huge between the respective economies. Plus, in recent years, many of their economies have actually stagnated. Yet, China's continued to grow, while the rest of the world suffered because of the 2008 recession. China largely did this because ever since around the year 2000, they had been building a huge reserve of foreign currency. This helped cushion them from the worst of the recession, while they also announced a series of policies to increase the credit supply and encourage lending. For instance, banks no longer needed to keep a certain amount of money in reserve anymore. So in essence, it was a huge stimulus package. This meant that infrastructure projects continue to get finances and people continue to work. It is in fact estimated that around $815 billion was loaned out in 2009, more than twice the annual average. So while the West retreated, China filled the void in many developing countries. Like investment in Africa had already shot up 45% from 2000 to 2008, when they spent $107 billion in just 1 year. And this would continue to grow. Most of this was in the pursuit of resources, like in Angola, which was supplying China with oil, or in Senegal, where they helped develop the industry in fisheries and sesame production. Sinopec also began looking for oil in Mali and Niger, while gold was being exploited in Tanzania. The Democratic Republic of Congo was home to many mineral treatment plants. The Chinese built bridges across the Niger River in Mali. In Senegal, they built the new National Theatre. In Angola, there were huge building complexes that have since become ghost towns. Roads were built in Zambia, stadiums in Sierra Leone and Benin, and in Ethiopia, the Chinese built the headquarters of the African Union. However, it was later revealed that the Chinese were in fact spying on members of the African Union within this building. In the east, the Chinese had already begun helping Tanzania build a railway line to Zambia since the 1980s, and they constructed a national stadium. Importantly, they also upgraded Zanzibar Airport and looked to build a new port. However, this was cancelled. Along with the upgrade of an airport in Mauritius, these would be some of the earliest plans for control over foreign ports and the creation of special economic zones. The Americans would call this the String of Pearls, a series of Chinese bases and allies stretching across the Indian Ocean, from Cambodia, where they were aiding their military and would later essentially take over Sihanoukville. In Malaysia, they would plan to build a forest city and gain influence over the strait. Sri Lanka, where they loaned billions for the construction of a new port, which the government could not pay back, therefore succumbing to debt-trap diplomacy. Maldives would suffer a similar fate to Sri Lanka. In Pakistan, a long-time Chinese ally, they developed the port of Gwadar. There was Salalah in Oman. Seychelles were granted loans they could not repay, and Mombasa in Kenya. Eventually, the Chinese would in fact join many nations in establishing a military base in Djibouti. Myanmar could also be put into the String of Pearls, but their relations were somewhat more complicated, as China was funding rebels in their country. To try and summarise this, the Chinese were close to the junta government of Myanmar, also supported the United Wa State Army, which was seeking independence. In this state, the people speak Mandarin along with Wa. Chinese money is commonly used, many of their laws are based on China's, and they even still have struggle sessions. So the region is heavily tied to China, and China continues to support them, along with potentially the Shan state and the Arakan army. But all of this expansion began to worry the Indians, who feared that the Chinese were planning to encircle them, especially as the Chinese Navy began to operate in the Red Sea to combat Somali piracy. They were joined by most major countries in targeting the pirates in late 2008, but this was the first time that their navy actually operated outside of Chinese waters. So whose policies abroad would actually lay the groundwork for what would become the Belt and Road Initiative. At home, though, who was determined to measure China's green GDP? This would, in essence, balance economic success with environmental cost. This, in turn, was part of his other concept, the scientific development concept. However, this wasn't really accepted by many people in the party. Plus, during his time in office, pollution didn't improve. Only 1% of China had air that would be deemed safe by EU regulation. Hundreds of thousands of people continue to die every year due to cancers caused by pollution, and a great deal of water became undrinkable. Whose other concepts were also ignored. For instance, one little addition he wanted to make to communist theory was his 8 honours and 8 shames. For instance, honour to those who are hard-working and shame on those who indulge in comfort and hate work. However, when compared to Mao's thought or Deng's theory, hasn't been widely accepted or enshrined, and who also had to deal with a number of scandals and disasters, Like in 2007, Mattel recalled Chinese-made toys because they used lead paint. Or in 2005, a petrochemical plant exploded on the Songhua River and released toxins that caused leukemia. Or in 2008, babies died due to contaminated baby formula. This sort of scandal would continue after Hu's time in office though. Like in 2013, 16,000 dead pigs were found in the river that supplied Shanghai with water, and many of these pigs were infected with PCV. All of this demonstrated to many people that corruption in China was becoming deadly, and it also hurt them internationally as well, as many countries stopped importing Chinese goods. Like in Taiwan, the 1025 protests tried to stop the ruling KMT party from increasing trade with the mainland. Taiwan, by the way, at this point had been ruled by Chen Shui-bian, the first non-KMT president. His party, though, pushed for independence rather than unification. So Hu Jintao passed the anti-secession law, making it legal to use force if Taiwan declared their independence. Hu then appealed to the KMT and invited their leaders to come to the mainland, the first time since the Civil War. Although there are of course many differences between the Communist Party and the KMT, both of them favoured a one China policy. And fortunately for Hu, the KMT would come back to power in 2008 with the election of Ma Ying-jeou. This new government actually would move against Chen and arrested him on corruption charges, but many believe this could have been politically motivated. So it was this KMT government that the 1025 protests were against. Back on the mainland, Hu, on paper, did try to clamp down on corruption, but it has also been reported that Wen Jiabao's family had accumulated $2.7 billion. So these anti-corruption campaigns, as always, seem to be an excuse to settle feuds rather than actually target corruption. This in turn meant that wealth disparity within the country continued to grow. Corruption also could have killed thousands of people when a huge earthquake hit Sichuan in 2008. 80,000 plus people were killed during this, and it was revealed that over 7,000 schools were built poorly, resulting in the deaths of maybe thousands of kids. But rather than target the corrupt officials, many people began to get angry with Falun Gong practitioners. By this point, they had already long been persecuted in the press. For instance, in 2001, 5 people self-immolated in Tiananmen Square. The government used this to show the population that this was a dangerous cult that focused on suicide. Then when the earthquake hit, many people accused them of celebrating, and practitioners were attacked on the streets of New York. 2008 was also the year that many of China's issues were highlighted to the world, as they hosted the Olympic Games. These games brought a great deal of prestige at home, but abroad they were somewhat overshadowed by unrest in Tibet and international protests against Chinese policies. So, the following year, Hu launched the 6521 project. The numbers here refer to the threats that Hu saw brewing within his country in 2009. It was the 60th anniversary of the foundation of the PRC, the 50th since the Tibetan Uprising, 20th since the Tiananmen Square massacre, and the 10th since the banning of Falun Gong. This group began to clamp down on any dissent, and the Great Firewall of China was extended, as foreign websites like Twitter, Hotmail and even Flickr were banned. Plus students or low-down officials were forced or hired to monitor signs of dissent and spread the party's message at home and abroad. These have been called the 50 Cent Army, and they were almost the spearhead of what the Chinese call netizens, people who make sure that Chinese discontent is silent, disinformation is spread, and China's image is maintained at home and abroad. All of this was further intensified when the Arab Spring began. The similarities between those regimes in the Middle East that fell and the Chinese communists are pretty clear. They offered no freedoms, had high inflation, had a huge wealth disparity, had corruption, and nepotism. In fact, in China, the Arab Spring did spread a little bit with the Jasmine Revolution. This began with calls to meet across all major cities under the guise of going on a stroll. However, just a few thousand people participated. Many participants were arrested, further discussion was suppressed, and even the sale of jasmine flowers was outlawed. The chairman of the National People's Congress, Wu Bangguo, then presented his 5 no's. like no elections, no separation of powers, and no diversified guiding principle. In general, China was able to nip any rebellion in the bud before the Arabs could, thanks to their huge infrastructure and initiatives like the 6521 project. At the head of this project was Xi Jinping. His rise to power was pretty standard, serving in regional governments like in Fujian and Shanghai. But he was a princeling, and whose government was trying to stop this nepotism, so he was initially ignored for further advancement. While he was in Fujian, Lai Changxing became one of the most influential and corrupt businessmen in the country. He built airports, imported 1/6 of China's oil, and owned a football club. He also had many connections to party members, but was still arrested, and Xi could well have got swept up in the scandal. But he continued working quietly, following the party line, and avoiding controversy until, in 2007, he was appointed to the Politburo. He eventually worked his way up and took top spot, but largely acted as a neutral between the other factions. In this spot, he gained widespread attention during the Olympics and his visits to the destroyed regions in Sichuan. Then, with the power to arrest accused dissidents, he went after human rights activists who signed a manifesto demanding basic rights. The authors of this manifesto, Charter 08, like Liu Xiaobo, were arrested, sparking huge international backlash. Plus, Liu was even awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his defiance. But Xi Jinping continued, and put hundreds of policemen around Tiananmen Square, and today, police checkpoints still exist, preventing any repeats of 1989. Xi also began to take trips to meet foreign leaders, fully expecting to succeed Hu Jintao in just a couple of years. However, one princeling was about to challenge him, Bo Xilai, the son of Bo Yibo. He had held a number of titles throughout his life, many accused him of self-promotion, and he didn't have many allies. So he was sent from Beijing to govern Chongqing, which was a sort of punishment because the Three Gorges Dam had just been completed. This project had long been a dream of Mao's, and he even wrote poems on the subject. Construction only began in 1994, and it caused huge problems, destroying much of the surrounding environment and displacing millions. Bo came into that region, though, and created his own set of policies known as the Chongqing Model. He went after organised crime, launched an anti-corruption campaign, and even tried to reinstill Maoist-era ethics with his Red Culture movement. For this, he promoted singing red songs, revolutionary opera, and even sent Mao's quotes to people's phones. This made him many allies among the more left-wing leaning members of the party, and he made himself incredibly popular among the people by developing the city. To do this, he subsidized housing, made it easier for rural people to move there, and encouraged foreign investments. But he was a self-promoter, and promoted himself across the country by doing things like televising his negotiations with striking taxi drivers. Then, to make sure that he got all of this done, he forced officials to work longer and longer hours to meet his demands. For his work, though, he was named one of the most influential people of 2010 among the party elites. He was growing more unpopular. Some criticize his personality-based rule as being dangerous, for instance. Then it was discovered that he had wiretapped the calls of Hu Jintao. But his final demise came in 2011 when a British man was found dead in a hotel in Chongqing. He had allegedly funneled money out of China for Bo's family, and the vice mayor of Chongqing revealed to the American embassy Bo's wife was involved in his murder and cover-up. Bo was quickly arrested. All of his old supporters were forced to follow the party line. This then freed up the path to power for Xi Jinping. However, just a few weeks before taking office, he disappeared. Nobody really knows why. Maybe he was just ill and didn't want to look weak. But there's another story from an anonymous source, that Xi was hit with a chair during a meeting among the new generation and old elites in the CCP. But I'd say take that with a pinch of salt. Well, in November 2012, he reappeared and was made chairman of the Central Committee. During his first appearance, he had a whole new government, except for Li Keqiang. He then embarked on a journey to the south, visiting the statue of Deng Xiaoping, while promising reforms in keeping with Deng. He then embarked on a journey to the south, visiting the statue of Deng Xiaoping, while promising reforms in keeping with Deng's ideas. It was also during this trip that he made his first reference to the Chinese dream. This is just the Chinese version of the American dream. However, it also included the dream to have a strong military. Xi also came up with his own guiding principles. As he announced, first of all, socialism with Chinese characteristics is socialism, not any other ism. The guiding principles of scientific socialism thus cannot be abandoned. And in a series of books, he set what would become Xi Jinping thought. For instance, why did the Communist Party of the Soviet Union fall from power? An important reason was that the struggle in the field of ideology was extremely intense, completely negating the history of the Soviet Union, negating Lenin, negating Stalin, creating historical nihilism and confused thinking, is a cautionary tale. Here he is obviously against historical revisionism. Plus, behind Xi was Wang Huning, who, back in 1991, wrote a book called America Against America. This book detailed his belief that the problems in the United States, like the decaying of social values and inequality, would eventually result in their demise. So, to stop this happening in China and to save the party, Xi once again set out to root out corruption. But once again, many people just believe that he targeted his political opponents. Amnesty International described this as a systematic threat to human rights, as the anti-corruption agency places tens of millions of people at the mercy of a secretive and virtually unaccountable system. Many of those that were targeted at the beginning were part of Jiang Zemin's faction. For instance, Zhou Yongkang and Zhu Kaiho. Jiang's faction beforehand had still formed a majority in the Politburo, and they would continue to be influential. Jiang's faction beforehand had formed a majority in the Politburo, but Xi now had far more power as ruler than Hu did. Xi was now free to pursue his own goals, with his own supporters filling top ranks. These supporters of his observers call the new Zhejiang army. Now with power, Xi Jinping increased the scope of government censorship. Dozens of websites, keywords and the likes were banned, even images of Winnie the Pooh, because people believed that Xi resembled Winnie the Pooh. Then in 2013 he spoke out against historical nihilism, which he believed was used by hostile forces to weaken the party. So a hotline and website was opened up to report on bloggers who engaged in it, and anyone who did so could face up to 3 years in prison. Later on, telecommunication carriers were told to block these users and anybody using a VPN. Then, to set about preventing further dissent in the country, Xi would launch anti-religious campaigns in 2014. This largely targeted people in Xinjiang province, who the government claimed were polluted by religious extremist forces. It should, by the way, be mentioned that some from Xinjiang did engage in terrorist activities. For instance, the Turkestan Islamic Party promoted Islamism and formed ties to terrorist groups around the world. Their leader, Abdul Haq, confirmed his loyalty to Al-Qaeda in 2016, and they had participated in the Afghan war. There was also the Turkestan Brigade, which participated in the Syrian civil war and consisted of around 4,000 people who, like their Islamist allies, conducted a number of war crimes. But the Chinese completely exaggerated the number of people who were Islamists, claiming up to 1/3 of the population were. And because of this, they were able to launch a series of repressive campaigns. People who were targeted included those who had an abnormal beard, didn't socialize a lot, and would consume too much electricity. These were allegedly signs of criminality or disloyalty, and the people could find themselves, along with their families, in re-education centres. These, however, are more like internment camps where inmates are forced to work, endure political indoctrination, and suffer constant abuse, including the rape of women. It's estimated that up to 2 million people have been interned, and somewhere between 5 and 10% of them have died in the camps. And here, once again, the Chinese government have been accused of organ harvesting. There are also reports that people in Xinjiang are forced to have abortions, as in some regions, their birth rates fell by 60% from 2015 to 2018. Many mosques have been destroyed, cultural and religious clothes are discouraged or banned, and Han migrants continue to move into the region. There was also a campaign called Pair Up and Become Family, where Han civil servants would pair up with Uyghurs to monitor them. So many have called this a cultural genocide. But Xi's power continued to grow, and a new cult of personality was created. A shrine of sorts was made in the village he was sent to work in when he was young, plus new songs like Xi Dada or Papa Xi were made, and citizens would perform group dances to it. Part of Xi's success does come from portraying China as a mighty power once again, ready to exert power across the world. Central to this idea is the Belt and Road Initiative, which would place a lot of countries along the old Silk Road under Chinese influence. However, the results of this are mixed. On the plus side, Chinese construction projects bolstered their image and reach around the world. Then, as countries fell into debt they could not repay, the Chinese were able to secure key ports and airports. However, in recent years, the number of projects have declined, and many junior partners have complained about corruption, further debt, and construction flaws. For instance, Kenya borrowed $5 billion to build a railway line from Mombasa to Uganda, but the train is running at a loss, Kenya can't afford the repayments, and construction ended abruptly in a field 320 kilometers away from Uganda. Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and many others have taken out similar loans to fund projects they largely can't afford. Yet China has still managed to negotiate the beginning of RCEP, a trading bloc to challenge the American planned TPP. However, India pulled out of this deal, and former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull called it a really low-ambition trade deal. But it's only really just come into effect in 2022, so it's still too early to make any real judgments on it. Xi also took a far more aggressive approach to the dispute in the South China Sea. Artificial islands were built, and their navy was dispatched to further cement their claims in this sea. This, however, has angered a number of nearby countries. Xi also broke the agreement China had with Hong Kong, ending democracy there and prompting the Umbrella Movement. While across the straits, he has also launched a far more aggressive policy in pursuing claims on Taiwan, at least in rhetoric. Chinese soldiers also clashed with Indian soldiers along the border as they try to build up their forces in disputed regions. While domestically, Xi has taken full control of the country and seems to be on the path to govern it for life. He's introduced a huge surveillance network and the social credit core system. This altogether has worsened China's relations with a great number of countries. At the beginning of his time in power, many were actually willing to try to repair relations with China. For instance, he was provided a golden carriage ride in the United Kingdom. But slowly some nations have begun to turn away from China, seeing them as a major threat in the world. For instance, the Quad was formed to counter China. This alliance includes powerful states like India, Japan, the United States and Australia, with New Zealand, South Korea and Vietnam all being part of Quad Plus. And, of course, recently, Xi implemented the zero COVID policy to combat the coronavirus. But now this is getting into politics and not history.
And thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. For those of you who do want to take part in this highly immersive vehicle game, please sign up using the link below, as you will unlock a lot of premium vehicles and the likes. I'll see you out there on the battlefield.